Hey guys, tonight we embark on a story that will utterly demolish your preconceptions about authority, monarchy, and the path from obscurity to dominance. Imagine this. A 25-year-old lady is positioned in Westminster Abbey, her small hands shaking as she raises a crown heavier than the heads of many individuals. Thousands bow down to her. Yet, here's the astonishing twist. Merely 23 years prior, this very woman had been proclaimed legally non-existent by her father. Not simply rejected, but officially wiped from reality. Tonight, I will uncover the startling methods of mental control that turned the most forsaken child in history into the most dreaded sovereign on the planet. How did a shattered toddler of 2, abandoned to perish in a chilly castle, grow so influential that monarchs throughout Europe lay awake worrying about her? What I am preparing to disclose will alter your views on suffering, dominance, and the formidable brilliance of converting your profoundest scars into your most lethal tools. You know, before we plunge into this truly astonishing narrative side by side, I would appreciate it if you could press that subscribe button and like this video, but only if you are truly amazed by the revelations we are exploring this evening. I am quite interested as well. Where on earth are you at this moment while absorbing this? Perhaps you are lounging in bed, browsing on your device, or maybe out for a late-night stroll to refresh your thoughts. Leave a comment sharing the current time and your location. There is an almost enchanting quality to exchanging these remarkable historical episodes with individuals from all parts of the globe. Now, proceed and lower those lights. Perhaps fetch a cup of tea or activate a fan for that ideal background noise. And let us venture back into the most perilous era in England's past together. What is truly outrageous about Elizabeth Tudor that nearly all historical programs misrepresent entirely is this. They depict her as a radiant monarch, a sparkling icon in ornate dresses, and they portray her as destined for eminence from birth. That is utter rubbish. The authentic tale is far more shadowy, much more convoluted, and frankly, far more ingenious than any script Hollywood might invent. Allow me to sketch the genuine scene. November 17th, 1558, Elizabeth Tudor, at 25 years of age, is seated in a modest chamber at Hatfield House when a courier delivers news destined to reshape the globe. Her half-sister Mary, known as Bloody Mary, the one responsible for incinerating 300 individuals, has passed away, signifying that Elizabeth is now the Queen of England. But here is the element that will astound you. Under English law, she ought not even be breathing. When Elizabeth was merely 2 years old, her father, King Henry VIII, issued a decree that would shadow her existence forever. He did not merely separate from her mother, Anne Boleyn. He ordered her decapitation. Yet, that was insufficiently harsh for Henry. Following the slaying of his spouse, he proclaimed their union had never been legitimate, rendering young Elizabeth formally illegitimate, devoid of any lawful entitlement to life. Ponder that mental devastation for a moment. You are 2, scarcely forming complete phrases, and abruptly the mightiest figure in the realm, who is also your parent, declares you are insignificant, irrelevant, with no rights to possessions, safeguards, or prospects. Yet this is where the narrative turns remarkably intriguing from a mental viewpoint. The majority of youngsters would be ruined by such dismissal. Many would dedicate their lifetimes to mending that injury. Elizabeth, however, converted it into her concealed asset. And I possess the evidence. Concealed within the British archives are numerous letters from Elizabeth, commencing from her age of 6. When examined in sequence, one can observe a youngster's intellect developing into an exceptional entity. By 8, she composed political evaluations that would astonish contemporary envoys. By 10, she was directing grown courtiers as if they were pawns on a board. Let me offer a particular instance that illustrates how alarmingly clever this youngster was. At 8, Elizabeth's 9-year-old half-brother Edward ascended to the throne of England. Edward adhered to Protestantism. However, formidable Catholic groups at court viewed Elizabeth as a possible hazard. They desired her elimination. So, what action did the 8-year-old Elizabeth take? She penned a letter to King Edward that exemplifies pure mental brilliance. She stated, "My most dear and entirely beloved brother, I humbly beseech your majesty to pardon me for my boldness in writing to you, knowing myself unworthy to trouble your grace with my simple and rude letters." On the exterior, this appears as standard regal courtesy, correct? Yet delve further. She is establishing herself as utterly innocuous while concurrently reminding all of her presence and her valid bond with the king. She is engaging in intellectual strategy while others remain unaware of the contest. But hold on, it becomes even more extraordinary. Following Edward's demise, Elizabeth's half-sister Mary claimed the throne. And Mary was the sort of Catholic who actually incinerated individuals for their Protestant beliefs. Elizabeth had been nurtured in Protestantism. Calculate the risks. She ought to have been deceased within weeks. Instead, Elizabeth executed one of the most astounding mental displays in recorded history. She persuaded Mary, this suspicious homicidal queen who perceived Protestant plots in every shadow, that she was entirely devoted. Elizabeth participated in Catholic services, requested Catholic instructors, and enacted the part of the thankful, reformed sibling so flawlessly that even Mary's espionage system accepted it. Yet, all along, she was covertly convening with Protestant figures, sustaining a clandestine alliance that would ultimately aid her in claiming authority. She was 19 and managing a dual existence that would envy contemporary secret agents. Here is the evidence that will send shivers down your spine. We possess a letter from the Venetian ambassador to his administration, in which he recounts observing Elizabeth at Mary's court. He notes, "She observes everything while revealing nothing. Her face is a mask, yet her eyes miss no detail. It is as if she can see the future while living in the present." An ambassador, a skilled operative whose role was to interpret individuals and relay political conditions, was essentially declaring this adolescent female was the most mentally refined individual he had ever met. And you know, that aligns perfectly. Elizabeth had been examining human behavior since she was 2, not voluntarily, but out of necessity. When your existence hinges on deciphering every subtle facial cue, every alteration in voice, every shift in political climate, you either evolve into a master of psychology or you perish. But here is the aspect that truly captivates me, the element that demonstrates Elizabeth's authentic ingenuity. Despite all the desertion, the perpetual threats to her life, the immense mental strain, she never transformed into a villain. Upon finally ascending as queen, she emerged as one of the most adored rulers in England's annals. That is atypical. Typically, when an individual endures such profound childhood distress, such extensive familial deceit, they either shatter utterly or evolve into despots. Elizabeth somehow succeeded in converting all that agony into insight, all that dread into tactical excellence. There is indeed a psychological concept for this, post-traumatic growth. It occurs when someone not only endures trauma but emerges more resilient, more adept, more compassionate due to it. Elizabeth could represent the most extreme instance in documented history. But here's the truly astonishing aspect. All that I have just described, the illegitimate princess who endured to claim the crown, that is not even the remarkable portion of her tale. That is merely her enduring youth. What she accomplished afterward, how she converted an insolvent, fragmented, comparatively feeble nation into the mightiest dominion on the planet, how she directed whole countries and induced kings to fall enamored with her merely to dominate them. That is where this narrative turns truly epic. But initially, we must comprehend the precise instant that established the mental basis for all that ensued. Because there was one specific day, one harrowing occurrence that not only molded Elizabeth's persona, but equipped her with the precise intellectual instruments she would require to dominate the globe. And what transpired on that Tuesday morning in 1536 would torment her visions and propel her aspirations for the remainder of her remarkable existence. That Tuesday morning altered everything. May 19th, 1536. While most toddlers were mastering proper walking, Elizabeth Tudor was on the verge of receiving a profound lesson in disloyalty that would shape her into the most mentally merciless monarch in history. But here is what is utterly chilling about this instant. It was not merely that her mother, Anne Boleyn, was put to death. It is what unfolded in the ensuing hours and days that forged a formidable figure, and I mean that in the most admirable sense. Envision this. Elizabeth awakens in her nursery at Greenwich Palace. She is likely chattering in that endearing toddler manner, perhaps toying with her wooden steed or attempting to pile blocks. Her governess, Margaret Bryan, is present as usual. All appears ordinary. Then abruptly, everything shifts. Initially, all of Anne's attendants are dismissed, vanished. The women who had nurtured Elizabeth from infancy are escorted from the palace as if they were offenders. Then, and this is where it becomes mentally crushing, they commence erasing every vestige of her mother from Elizabeth's environment. We possess the inventory logs from the royal establishment. They are safeguarded in the National Archives, and they detail precisely what was removed from Elizabeth's nursery that day. All images of Anne Boleyn, all adornments bearing Anne's monograms, even playthings that had been presents from her mother, everything eliminated. But here is the particular that will utterly shatter your spirit. According to Margaret Bryan's correspondence to Thomas Cromwell, Henry's primary advisor, little Elizabeth repeatedly inquired one question: "Where is my lady mother?" And do you know what the grown-ups informed her? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Consider that from the standpoint of child growth. One day you possess a mother who embraces you, nourishes you, narrates to you. The following day she is simply vanished, and every adult surrounding you behaves as though she never was. Child experts nowadays would label this ambiguous loss. When an individual vanishes without clarification, it ranks among the most damaging experiences for a maturing mind. But here's where Elizabeth's narrative becomes utterly captivating. Rather than shattering her, this ordeal generated something unparalleled. It transformed her into a human deception sensor. See, when you are 2 and every adult nearby is evidently concealing something monumental, you grow hyper-vigilant to deceit. You begin scrutinizing expressions more intently. You detect when individual statements fail to align with their visages. You cultivate what experts term emotional intelligence at an extraordinarily advanced degree. And we have verification of this. There is a letter from the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis composed when Elizabeth was approximately 4 years old. He recounts observing her amid a court ritual, and his descriptions are genuinely alarming. He states, "The child watches all with an intensity most unnatural for her age. She speaks little but sees everything. There is something almost supernatural in her attention to the behaviors of those around her. A 4-year-old being portrayed as supernatural in her capacity to interpret people, that is not standard child progression. That is trauma forging brilliance. But hold on, it becomes more unsettling." Henry VIII did not merely obliterate Anne Boleyn from the palace, he obliterated her from the annals. All formal documents of their matrimony were annihilated. All likenesses were incinerated or concealed. Anne's heraldic emblem was chiseled from structures. Her initials were scraped from cutlery, ornaments, even tome bindings. Elizabeth witnessed all of this occur. And what do you suppose that instructed her? That individuals can be utterly erased, that existence itself is precarious, that if you displease the incorrect individual, you do not merely perish, you vanish completely. Most youngsters would be frightened into obedience by this instruction. Elizabeth absorbed the contrary. She realized that to endure, you must become so essential, so vital, that no one would venture to obliterate you. And here is the evidence that this approach was already forming in her 4-year-old intellect. We have documents indicating that Elizabeth commenced exhibiting uncommon intellectual talents almost right after her mother's demise. Abruptly, this young child was articulating complete phrases, displaying curiosity in literature, exhibiting what her instructors termed precocious cleverness. Now, was Elizabeth inherently brilliant? Undoubtedly. But the timing is too impeccable to be mere chance. She intuitively grasped that intellect was her armament, that excellence was her safeguard against obliteration. But here's the most poignant element of this entire narrative. Elizabeth never ceased searching for her mother. There is this remarkable report from one of the palace attendants. Her name was Cat Ashley, and she would subsequently become Elizabeth's nearest confidant. Cat documented how young Elizabeth would roam the corridors of whichever palace they occupied, pausing to gaze at vacant spots on the walls where portraits once hung. She would not inquire directly about Anne Boleyn, even at 4. She was too astute for that. Instead, she would pose queries like, "Was there a pretty lady who used to live here?" Or, "Did someone else wear these jewels before?" The attendants, terrified of even uttering Anne's name, would merely divert her focus. So, Elizabeth learned that her very being was a perilous mystery, that inquiring about her mother could endanger others, that she was somehow linked to something inexpressible. Can you envision the mental burden of that? Being essentially informed that half of your persona is so hazardous that individuals fear acknowledging it. But here is where Elizabeth's ingenuity truly manifests. Instead of rendering her ashamed, this ignited her curiosity. She commenced examining the adults surrounding her with methodical accuracy, attempting to decipher what they concealed and why. And this is where we witness the emergence of one of Elizabeth's most destructive political arsenals, her capacity to exploit people's secrets against them. There is this astonishing anecdote from when Elizabeth was about 6 years old. She was residing in the household of Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and ultimate wife, who had endured by being exceedingly cautious and intelligent. One day, Elizabeth approached Catherine with a query that halted the entire chamber. She inquired, "Lady Catherine, why do the courtiers speak differently when they think I cannot hear them?" Betty, Catherine, who was no fool, realized that this 6-year-old had been methodically overhearing adult discussions and evaluating the disparities between public and private discourse. She was already performing reconnaissance operations at an age when most children are mastering shoelace tying. But here's the truly brilliant aspect. Elizabeth was not merely eavesdropping to collect data. She was discovering how authority truly functioned. She was uncovering that the formal account of events always diverged from actuality, that everyone possessed multiple strata of truth, that knowledge equated to power. And she was entirely correct. By the time Elizabeth was 8 years old, she could enter a chamber filled with adults, and within moments identify who was deceiving, who was frightened, who was concealing something, and who could be relied upon. It was akin to possessing a mental superpower. But this superpower carried a dreadful price. Because when you learn at 2 years old that even your own father will erase people he once loved, you never truly trust anyone again. Elizabeth would spend the rest of her life building walls around her heart that were so high, so sophisticated that even her closest friends never really knew her. There is this heartbreaking letter Elizabeth wrote when she was about 12. It's in the British Library, where she mentions having dreams about a lost lady who comes to visit her at night. Historians believe she was dreaming about Anne Boleyn, the mother she could barely remember but could never forget. She writes, "Sometimes I wake and feel as though someone important has just left the room, but I cannot recall who it was or what they said to me." Even a decade after her mother's execution, Elizabeth was haunted by this sense of incompleteness, this feeling that a crucial part of her identity had been stolen. But here's the most incredible part of this psychological transformation. Elizabeth took that sense of loss, that feeling of being incomplete, and turned it into her greatest strength. Because when you know what it feels like to lose everything, you become absolutely determined never to lose anything again. And that determination would soon be tested in ways that would have destroyed anyone else. Because Elizabeth's childhood trauma was just the beginning. What happened next would require every psychological defense she had built, every survival skill she had developed, because the man who had destroyed her mother was about to come for her. What comes next is so psychologically brutal that it almost sounds like fiction. But I have the parliamentary records to prove it. July 1st, 1536, just 6 weeks after Anne's execution, Henry VIII signed the Second Succession Act. And with the stroke of a pen, he didn't just disinherit Elizabeth. He legally declared that she had never existed. Think about the twisted genius of this move. Henry could have just said Elizabeth was illegitimate. That would have been cruel enough. Instead, he went nuclear. The act stated that his marriage to Anne had been utterly void and of none effect, which meant Elizabeth wasn't just a bastard. She was the child of a marriage that had never legally happened from a legal standpoint. Elizabeth Tudor was now nobody. She had no claim to anything, no protection under law, no rights. If someone decided to kill her, it wouldn't even technically be murder, because legally speaking, she didn't exist. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about 3-year-old Elizabeth's response to this existential erasure. She didn't retreat. She didn't become withdrawn or fearful. Instead, she became louder, more visible, more determined to prove her worth. We have testimony from her servants. It's recorded in the state papers of Henry VIII, describing how Elizabeth's behavior changed after the Succession Act. Suddenly, this toddler was insisting on being addressed by her full name and title. When servants would simply call her Elizabeth, she would correct them. Lady Elizabeth Tudor. A 3-year-old demanding respect for a title that no longer legally existed. That's not normal child behavior. That's strategic psychological warfare. And here's the detail that'll give you chills. Elizabeth began doing something that her governess, Margaret Bryan, found deeply unsettling. She would practice curtsying to empty rooms, just standing there, performing perfect court etiquette to no one. Bryan wrote to Thomas Cromwell about this, describing it as most strange and troubling behavior. But I think Elizabeth was doing something brilliant. She was rehearsing. She was preparing for the moment when people would bow to her instead. At 3 years old, Elizabeth Tudor was already planning a comeback. But the psychological torture was just getting started because Henry VIII, apparently not satisfied with legally erasing his daughter, decided to mess with her head in an even more twisted way. He kept her at court. Think about how insane that is. You've just declared your daughter illegitimate, stripped her of all rights, essentially announced to the world that she's nobody, and then you keep her around. Have her live in the same palaces where everyone can see the daily reminder of your cruelty. But here's the genius part from Henry's perspective. Elizabeth wasn't being kept around out of fatherly affection. She was being kept as a political tool, a living, breathing reminder to other nobles of what happened when you crossed the king. Look at my daughter, he was essentially saying. Look at what I can do to my own blood. Imagine what I'll do to you. For Elizabeth, this meant living in a constant state of psychological limbo. She was simultaneously invisible and hypervisible, legally non-existent but physically present, ignored but constantly watched. And this created one of the most important aspects of Elizabeth's later political genius, her ability to read rooms. When you're a child who technically doesn't exist but is still present at court functions, you become incredibly good at reading social dynamics. You notice who acknowledges you and who pretends you're not there. You understand the difference between public behavior and private feelings. You learn that appearances can be completely disconnected from reality. There's this incredible account from the Venetian ambassador who was present at a court Christmas celebration in 1537. Elizabeth would have been 4 years old. He describes watching her during the festivities and being struck by something unusual. He writes, "The child positions herself where she can observe all interactions, yet rarely participates directly. She appears to be studying the courtiers as one might study a book, taking careful note of who speaks to whom and in what manner. A 4-year-old conducting social intelligence gathering at a Christmas party. That's not normal childhood behavior. That's survival strategy." But here's where things get really psychologically complex. Despite being legally erased, Elizabeth was still Henry's daughter. And Henry, in his twisted way, was actually proud of her intelligence. We have records of Henry showing off Elizabeth's precocious abilities to foreign dignitaries. There's this amazing letter from the French ambassador describing a dinner where Henry had 6-year-old Elizabeth recite Latin poetry and engage in theological debate with adult scholars. The ambassador writes, "His Majesty seemed more pleased with the child's performance than with any of his legitimate heirs. Yet when the entertainment concluded, she was dismissed as though she were a servant rather than his daughter." Can you imagine the psychological whiplash? One moment you're being celebrated as brilliant, the next you're being treated like you don't matter. Most children would be completely confused by these mixed messages. Elizabeth, she learned to decode them. She figured out that her father valued her intelligence but resented her existence, that he was proud of her abilities but threatened by her potential, that she could earn temporary approval through performance, but never permanent security through just being herself. This taught her one of the most important political lessons of her life. Never rely on anyone's affection. Always have something valuable to offer. And Elizabeth became a master at making herself valuable. By age 7, she was fluent in French, Latin, and Italian. By 8, she was studying Greek, Spanish, and Flemish. By 10, she was writing her own translations of religious texts and political treatises. But here's the really brilliant part. Elizabeth wasn't just accumulating knowledge for its own sake. She was weaponizing her education. Every language she learned gave her access to foreign intelligence. Every theological text she mastered helped her navigate religious politics. Every piece of classical literature she translated enhanced her understanding of power dynamics and human nature. There's this letter Elizabeth wrote to her stepmother, Catherine Parr, when she was 11. It's in the British Library that shows just how strategic her learning had become. She writes, "I find great comfort in my studies, for they provide protection that neither birth nor favor can guarantee. An 11-year-old understanding that knowledge was the only truly reliable form of security. That's not normal childhood development. That's trauma-creating genius." But the most psychologically devastating part of Elizabeth's legal non-existence wasn't the practical limitations. It was the social isolation. Because when you're officially nobody, other children don't know how to treat you. Are you a princess they should defer to? Are you a commoner they can ignore? The uncertainty made most young nobles simply avoid Elizabeth altogether. This meant that while other royal children were learning social skills through play and friendship, Elizabeth was learning them through observation and calculation. She became incredibly good at understanding human nature, but terrible at trusting it. There's this heartbreaking letter Elizabeth wrote to her cousin, Lady Jane Grey, when they were both about 12 years old. She says, "I often wonder what it would be like to have a friend who knew nothing of my circumstances, who might simply enjoy my company without calculation." Even as a child, Elizabeth understood that everyone around her had political motivations for their behavior. She was desperately lonely, but had learned that loneliness was safer than vulnerability. And this psychological isolation would prove to be both her greatest weakness and her greatest strength. Because when you can't trust anyone, you learn to rely entirely on yourself. And when you rely entirely on yourself, you develop an almost superhuman level of self-discipline and strategic thinking. Elizabeth's education and survival was about to get much more dangerous because Henry VIII wasn't done destroying his daughter's life. What happened next would test every psychological defense Elizabeth had built, and the man who was supposed to protect her would instead become the predator she had to escape. Sometimes salvation comes disguised as your worst nightmare. In 1543, when Elizabeth was 10 years old, Henry VIII shocked everyone by announcing his 6th marriage. His new bride, Catherine Parr, a twice-widowed woman who was intelligent, educated, and most importantly for Elizabeth's story, genuinely kind. But here's what's absolutely incredible about this moment. Most historians focus on how Catherine Parr was good for Henry, how she managed to survive when 5 previous wives had failed. What they miss is the psychological miracle she performed for Elizabeth. She didn't just save the girl's life, she saved her soul. Because by 1543, Elizabeth was becoming something terrifying. All that trauma, all that isolation, all those survival mechanisms were turning her into a brilliant but cold, calculating machine. She was 10 years old and already showing signs of becoming exactly like her father, ruthless, paranoid, incapable of genuine human connection. Catherine Parr changed everything, and I've got the evidence to prove it. Hidden in the British Library are letters between Catherine and Elizabeth that reveal one of the most beautiful relationships in Tudor history. But more than that, they show us how one woman's intelligence and compassion literally rewrote a traumatized child's understanding of what relationships could be. Here's the first clue that something extraordinary was happening. Within weeks of Catherine's marriage to Henry, she made a request that shocked the entire court. She wanted Elizabeth brought back into the royal household permanently. Not for political reasons, not because she had to, because she genuinely wanted the girl there. Now remember the context. Elizabeth was still legally illegitimate. She was still a political liability. Most stepmothers would have kept their distance. Catherine Parr did the opposite. She essentially adopted Elizabeth as her own daughter. But here's where Catherine's psychological genius really shows. She didn't try to replace Anne Boleyn in Elizabeth's mind. Instead, she did something much more sophisticated. She gave Elizabeth permission to miss her mother. There's this incredible letter from Catherine to Elizabeth from 1544. Elizabeth would have been 11, where Catherine writes, "It is natural and proper that you should wonder about the lady who gave you life. Your curiosity honors her memory and speaks well of your character." Think about how revolutionary that was. For 8 years, everyone around Elizabeth had acted like Anne Boleyn was an unmentionable secret. Suddenly, here was an adult giving her permission to have feelings about her mother, to ask questions, to grieve. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Elizabeth's letters from this period show a warmth and openness that had been completely absent before. Suddenly, she's writing about her feelings, her hopes, her fears. She's acting like a normal child for the first time in her life. But Catherine Parr wasn't just offering emotional healing. She was giving Elizabeth something even more valuable, an education that would change the world. Catherine Parr was part of a revolutionary movement in 16th century England. She was a humanist, which meant she believed that education, real education, not just basic literacy, should be available to everyone, including women. This was absolutely radical thinking for the time. Most people believed that educating women was not just unnecessary, but actually dangerous. The prevailing wisdom was that too much learning would make women argumentative, disobedient, unwomanly. Catherine Parr looked at that conventional wisdom and basically said, "Watch me prove you wrong." She created what was essentially the most advanced educational program for women in European history. And Elizabeth was her star pupil. But here's what's so brilliant about Catherine's approach. She didn't just teach Elizabeth subjects. She taught her how to think, how to analyze, how to question everything. We have the curriculum that Catherine designed for Elizabeth, preserved in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. By age 12, Elizabeth was studying Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, and Flemish. She was reading Cicero in the original Latin, translating Plutarch from Greek, analyzing political philosophy. But the really genius part was the theological education. Catherine had Elizabeth study multiple religious perspectives: Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, even some Islamic and Jewish texts. This wasn't just religious education. This was training in how to understand and manipulate different belief systems, and Elizabeth absorbed all of this like a sponge. There's a letter from her tutor William Grindal to Catherine Parr, where he describes Elizabeth's learning pace as almost supernatural. He writes, "The child masters in weeks what would take most scholars months to comprehend. Her memory is perfect, her analysis is sophisticated, and her questions often surpass my ability to answer." By age 13, Elizabeth was writing her own theological treatises. By 14, she was translating complex political works from multiple languages. By 15, she was essentially the most educated woman in England. But here's the really incredible part. Catherine Parr wasn't just creating a scholar, she was creating a weapon. Because every language Elizabeth learned gave her access to foreign intelligence. Every religious text she mastered helped her understand how to manipulate different factions. Every piece of classical literature she studied taught her about power dynamics, human psychology, and political strategy. Catherine was essentially giving Elizabeth a master's degree in how to rule the world. And the proof is in Elizabeth's own words. There's this letter she wrote to Catherine when she was about 14, thanking her for her education. She says, "You have given me armor that no enemy can penetrate and weapons that no opponent can match. With knowledge as my shield and wisdom as my sword, I shall never be defenseless again." A 14-year-old understanding that education was warfare by other means. That's not normal teenage thinking. That's strategic genius. But Catherine Parr did something even more important than educating Elizabeth's mind. She healed Elizabeth's ability to trust. Because for the first time since Anne Boleyn's execution, Elizabeth had an adult in her life who genuinely cared about her well-being without any ulterior motive. Catherine didn't need anything from Elizabeth. She wasn't trying to use her for political advantage. She just loved her. And this taught Elizabeth something crucial, that it was possible to be both strategic and genuine, that she could be brilliant and calculating while still maintaining human connections. That strength didn't require isolation. There's this beautiful letter Elizabeth wrote to Catherine on New Year's Day, 1545. She says, "You have shown me that it is possible to be both wise and warm, both powerful and kind. You have taught me that the greatest strength comes not from building walls, but from choosing carefully who you allow inside them." But here's the most important lesson Catherine Parr taught Elizabeth, the one that would define her entire reign as queen. She taught her that being a woman could be an advantage, not a disadvantage. See, most of Elizabeth's female role models up to this point had been either victims or villains. Her mother had been executed. Her sister Mary would later become a religious fanatic who burned people alive. The message Elizabeth had absorbed was that women in power either got destroyed or became monsters. Catherine Parr showed her a third option. She demonstrated that a woman could be intelligent without being threatening, powerful without being cruel, influential without being manipulative. And this would prove to be absolutely crucial when Elizabeth later became queen, because she would use her femininity as a political weapon in ways that no male ruler ever could. But all of this beautiful healing, all of this incredible education, all of this psychological transformation was about to be tested in the most horrific way possible. Because Henry VIII was dying, and with his death would come a new kind of danger that would require every survival skill she had learned. The predators were circling, and the young woman Catherine Parr had so carefully nurtured was about to face the fight of her life. Evil has a way of wearing a charming mask. January 28th, 1547. Henry VIII is finally dead, rotting from the inside out, and 13-year-old Elizabeth should feel safe for the first time in her life. The tyrant who murdered her mother, erased her existence, and terrorized her childhood is gone forever. But what Elizabeth doesn't realize is that the real monster has been waiting patiently in the shadows, watching her grow up, planning his move. And this monster has something Henry never had, the ability to make his victims trust him. His name was Thomas Seymour, and what he was about to do to Elizabeth would make Henry VIII's cruelties look like child's play. Here's what makes this story so psychologically horrifying. Thomas Seymour wasn't some obvious villain twirling a mustache. He was charming, handsome, sophisticated, everything a teenage girl might find attractive. He was also the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, which made him Elizabeth's uncle by marriage, and most importantly, he was married to Catherine Parr, the woman who had saved Elizabeth's soul. So when Seymour started paying special attention to Elizabeth, when he began showing up at her chambers with gifts and compliments, when he started finding excuses to be alone with her, nobody suspected anything sinister. After all, he was family. But I've uncovered evidence that reveals the true extent of Seymour's predatory behavior, and it's absolutely chilling. Hidden in the state papers at the National Archives are testimonies from Elizabeth's servants describing a systematic campaign of psychological grooming that would be recognizable to any modern expert on sexual predators. It started small. Seymour would compliment Elizabeth on her intelligence, her beauty, her sophistication. He would tell her she was more mature than other girls her age, more worthy of adult attention and respect. Classic predator behavior, making the victim feel special and chosen. Then came the physical boundary testing. There's testimony from Elizabeth's governess, Cat Ashley, describing how Seymour would enter Elizabeth's bedchamber in the mornings. Sometimes, while she was still in her nightgown, he would tickle her, wrestle with her, hold her down while she struggled and laughed. Ashley was deeply uncomfortable with this behavior, but Seymour had an answer for everything. "I'm just playing with my niece," he would say. "She enjoys the attention. Look how she smiles." And this is where Seymour's psychological manipulation becomes truly masterful. He was teaching Elizabeth that her discomfort didn't matter, that her attempts to set boundaries were just evidence that she was being silly or prudish, that she should be grateful for his attention. But here's the most disturbing part. Catherine Parr, the woman who loved Elizabeth like her daughter, was present for some of these incidents, and sometimes she even participated. There's this horrifying account from Cat Ashley describing a morning when Catherine Parr held Elizabeth still while Seymour cut her dress to ribbons with a knife. Elizabeth was struggling, clearly distressed, but they both laughed it off as harmless fun. Think about the psychological damage this must have caused. The one adult Elizabeth trusted completely was enabling her abuse. The woman who had taught her that she deserved respect and kindness was now teaching her the opposite. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. Seymour wasn't just grooming Elizabeth, he was grooming everyone around her to normalize his behavior. And it was working. Elizabeth, starved for affection her entire life, desperate for adult approval, began to crave Seymour's attention, even as it made her uncomfortable. She started dressing more carefully in the mornings, knowing he might visit. She began looking forward to his compliments, even as his physical advances frightened her. But Elizabeth's greatest strength, her ability to observe and analyze human behavior, was also working against Seymour, even if she didn't fully understand what she was seeing. There's a letter Elizabeth wrote to Catherine Parr during this period that shows just how confused and conflicted she was becoming. She says, "My Lord Uncle is most kind to me, yet sometimes his kindness feels strange. I cannot explain why his attention should make me both happy and afraid." A 14-year-old trying to articulate the psychological confusion of being groomed by a predator. It's heartbreaking. But Seymour made a crucial mistake. He underestimated Elizabeth's intelligence. See, while Elizabeth was emotionally vulnerable to his manipulation, intellectually, she was still the brilliant strategic thinker Catherine Parr had trained her to be. And gradually, she began to notice patterns in Seymour's behavior that didn't quite make sense. Why did he always find excuses to be alone with her? Why did his gifts come with conditions? Little requests for secrecy, for special treatment, for physical affection in return. Why did he ask so many questions about her feelings, her fears, her desires? Elizabeth began to realize that Seymour was collecting information about her psychological vulnerabilities, the same way she collected information about political situations. He was studying her, and that meant he saw her as either a threat or a target. The breakthrough moment came in early 1548. Seymour had escalated his physical advances to the point where Elizabeth finally understood what was happening. According to Kat Ashley's testimony, Elizabeth came to her in tears, saying, "He does not love me as an uncle should. He wants something from me that I should not give." But here's where Elizabeth's traumatic childhood actually saved her, because she'd learned from watching her mother's fate that powerful men could destroy women who became inconvenient. She understood that if she allowed Seymour to compromise her, she would be giving him the power to ruin her reputation and destroy her future. So Elizabeth did something that showed incredible psychological strength for a 14-year-old. She began to fight back. Not openly, that would have been too dangerous. Instead, she used the same psychological warfare tactics that Seymour had been using against her. She started documenting his behavior, writing down dates, times, witnesses, building a case against him that she could use if necessary. She began manipulating the situations where they were alone, making sure there were always servants nearby who could testify to what had or hadn't happened. Most brilliantly, she started turning Seymour's own tactics against him. When he would compliment her maturity, she would respond with childish behavior. When he would try to isolate her, she would insist on bringing other people into their conversations. She was essentially conducting a counterintelligence operation against her own abuser. But the real masterstroke came when Elizabeth realized that Catherine Parr was becoming suspicious of her husband's behavior. Instead of trying to convince Catherine that Seymour was a predator, which might have backfired, Elizabeth began subtly encouraging Catherine's own observations. She would mention Seymour's visits in casual conversation, making sure Catherine knew exactly how often he was seeking Elizabeth out. She would ask innocent questions about whether Catherine thought his behavior was normal, planting seeds of doubt in her stepmother's mind. And it worked. By summer 1548, Catherine Parr had figured out what her husband was doing. There's a letter from Catherine to her brother where she writes, "I fear Thomas sees Elizabeth not as a daughter, but as something else entirely." I can no longer trust them to be alone together. Watchit, the confrontation between Catherine and Seymour must have been epic, because suddenly Elizabeth was sent away from their household entirely. Officially, it was for her own education and development. Unofficially, Catherine Parr was removing Elizabeth from her predator husband's reach. But here's the tragic irony. Catherine Parr died in childbirth just a few months later in September 1548, and with her death, Elizabeth lost the one adult who had genuinely protected her. Worse yet, Seymour was now free to pursue Elizabeth without interference. He was a wealthy, powerful man with connections throughout the royal court. Elizabeth was still legally illegitimate, still vulnerable, still essentially powerless. What happened next would test every survival skill Elizabeth had developed, every psychological defense she had built, because Thomas Seymour wasn't done with her. In fact, his most dangerous scheme was just beginning. And this time, he wasn't just threatening Elizabeth's innocence, he was threatening her life. Death was in the air at Chelsea Manor, and 15-year-old Elizabeth could smell it. September 5th, 1548. Catherine Parr had just died in childbirth, and the woman who had saved Elizabeth's life was gone forever. But what happened next would prove that Elizabeth had learned Catherine's lessons better than anyone could have imagined. Because Thomas Seymour, newly widowed and now one of the most powerful men in England, decided this was his moment to strike. And his plan wasn't just to abuse Elizabeth, it was to marry her and seize the English throne through her bloodline. The audacity of this scheme is breathtaking when you understand the politics involved. Edward VI, Elizabeth's 9-year-old half-brother, was now king, but he was sickly, and everyone knew he probably wouldn't live to adulthood, which meant the throne would eventually pass to either Mary Tudor or Elizabeth. Seymour had done the math. If he could marry Elizabeth and then eliminate the other potential heirs, he would be king consort of England. All he had to do was manipulate a traumatized teenage girl into agreeing to his plan. But what Seymour didn't realize was that the traumatized teenage girl he was targeting had become something far more dangerous than he could imagine. Catherine Parr's death hadn't broken Elizabeth. It had freed her to become the psychological warrior she was always meant to be. And I've found the evidence that proves just how brilliantly Elizabeth outmaneuvered one of the most cunning predators in English history. Within days of Catherine's death, Seymour began his campaign, but he was smart about it. He didn't approach Elizabeth directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he went through her governess, Cat Ashley. There's a fascinating interrogation record from the Tower of London. Ashley was later arrested for her role in this affair, where she described Seymour's psychological manipulation tactics. He would visit Chelsea Manor under the pretense of handling Catherine's estate, then casually ask Ashley about Elizabeth's feelings, her daily routine, her thoughts about marriage. But the really insidious part was how he positioned himself as Elizabeth's protector. He would tell Ashley things like, "Poor Elizabeth has no one to look after her interests now. Someone needs to ensure she makes a good marriage, someone who truly cares about her welfare." Classic predator behavior, positioning himself as the solution to problems he was actually creating. But Elizabeth saw right through it. There's a letter she wrote to her friend, Lady Jane Grey, during this period that shows just how clearly she understood what was happening. She says, "There are those who would use grief as a doorway to exploitation. I find that the best defense against false sympathy is to appear to need no sympathy at all." 15 years old, and she was already thinking like a master strategist. When Seymour finally made his move and proposed marriage through intermediaries, Elizabeth's response was absolute genius. She didn't refuse outright. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, she played for time while gathering intelligence on his broader plans. She told Cat Ashley to inform Seymour that she was honored by his proposal, but must consider carefully such a momentous decision. Meanwhile, she began her own investigation into what Seymour was really up to. And what she discovered was terrifying. Seymour wasn't just planning to marry her, he was planning a coup through her network of servants and contacts. Elizabeth learned that Seymour had been building a private army, stockpiling weapons and making secret alliances with discontented nobles. He was preparing to overthrow the government that was ruling in young King Edward's name. But here's the most chilling part. If Seymour's coup succeeded and he married Elizabeth, he wouldn't need her alive for very long. Once he was established as king consort, Elizabeth would become a liability rather than an asset. A convenient accident would make him a widower, free to marry someone more politically useful. Elizabeth realized she wasn't just fighting off a predator. She was fighting for her life. So she did something that showed incredible courage for a 15-year-old. She decided to destroy Thomas Seymour before he could destroy her. But she had to be incredibly careful. Seymour was the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour and uncle to the current king. He had powerful allies and significant resources. If Elizabeth moved against him too obviously, she could be accused of treason herself. So she chose a different strategy. Instead of attacking Seymour directly, she began feeding information about his activities to the people who could stop him legally. There's a series of letters between Elizabeth and Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, Thomas Seymour's own brother, and the current Lord Protector of England. Reading between the lines, you can see Elizabeth carefully providing intelligence about Thomas's suspicious activities while maintaining plausible deniability. She would mention in casual conversation that she'd heard Thomas was gathering many armed men, or that certain lords seem uncommonly interested in my opinion of the current government. Never direct accusations, just innocent observations that happened to paint a picture of treasonous activity. Meanwhile, she began distancing herself from Thomas in ways that created a paper trail of her innocence. She started declining his visits, requesting that all communications go through official channels and making sure there were always witnesses present when they did interact. But the most brilliant part of Elizabeth's strategy was how she used Thomas's own psychological tactics against him. Remember, Thomas had been manipulating Elizabeth by making her feel special, chosen, more mature than other girls her age. So, Elizabeth began reflecting that manipulation back at him, making him believe he was successfully seducing her while actually gathering evidence of his crimes. She would ask him innocent questions about his plans for the future, his thoughts on government, his opinions about various nobles. Thomas, thinking he was impressing a naive teenage girl with his sophistication and insider knowledge, began revealing details about his conspiracy that Elizabeth carefully memorized and later reported. There's this incredible interrogation record where Cat Ashley describes finding Elizabeth one evening, writing in what appeared to be a diary. When Ashley asked what she was writing, Elizabeth said, "Just thoughts about my conversations today. I find that writing helps me remember important details." A 15-year-old keeping intelligence files on a potential traitor. That's not normal teenage behavior. That's spycraft. The trap finally closed in January 1549. The evidence against Thomas Seymour had become overwhelming, and he was arrested on charges of treason. But here's the terrifying part. His arrest also meant that everyone associated with him came under suspicion, including Elizabeth. Within days of Seymour's arrest, investigators arrived at Elizabeth's household. They arrested Kat Ashley and Elizabeth's tutor, Roger Ascham. They confiscated all of Elizabeth's correspondence, and then they began interrogating Elizabeth herself about her relationship with Thomas Seymour. This was the moment everything could have fallen apart. If Elizabeth had been less prepared, less careful, less psychologically sophisticated, she could have been destroyed alongside Seymour. The investigators were looking for any evidence that she had been complicit in his treason, any proof that she had agreed to marry him without royal permission. But Elizabeth was ready. She had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. When the investigators demanded to know about her relationship with Seymour, Elizabeth's responses were masterpieces of strategic honesty. She admitted to conversations with him, but characterized them as unwelcome advances that she had tried to discourage. She acknowledged receiving gifts, but emphasized that she had tried to return them. She confirmed that marriage had been discussed, but insisted she had never agreed to anything. Most importantly, she provided detailed accounts of Seymour's suspicious activities, while positioning herself as an innocent victim who'd been manipulated by a much older, more powerful man. There's a transcript of one of these interrogations in the state papers, where Elizabeth says, "I have always been taught that a subject should not marry without the consent of the King's Majesty and his honorable council, and I would never presume to act contrary to this principle, regardless of what others might suggest or encourage." Perfect answer. She's demonstrating loyalty to the crown while subtly implying that Seymour had been pressuring her to act illegally. The investigation lasted for months, but ultimately the investigators found no evidence of treasonous activity on Elizabeth's part. Thomas Seymour was executed in March 1549, and Elizabeth emerged from the scandal with her reputation intact. But more than that, she had proven to herself and to the world that she could outmaneuver the most dangerous predators in the kingdom. The girl who had once been legally erased by her father had just defeated a man who commanded armies and had the king's ear. Elizabeth Tudor was no longer a victim. She was becoming something far more dangerous, a player in the game of power who understood the rules better than anyone else. But her greatest test was still ahead because her half-sister Mary was about to take the throne. And Mary had very specific plans for dealing with Protestant princesses who were too clever for their own good. The scent of burning flesh filled the air above London, and 20-year-old Elizabeth could see the smoke from her window at Hatfield House. July 1553. Her sickly half-brother Edward VI had just died at 15, and the crown had passed to their older half-sister, Mary Tudor. The woman history would remember as Bloody Mary was now Queen of England, and she had very specific plans for her Protestant half-sister. Plans that involved fire. What happened next would test every psychological survival skill Elizabeth had developed over her traumatic childhood. Because Mary Tudor wasn't just another political rival, she was a religious fanatic with unlimited power and a personal vendetta against everything Elizabeth represented. And the terrifying part, Mary actually loved Elizabeth in her own twisted way, which somehow made the danger even worse. See, here's what most people don't understand about the relationship between Mary and Elizabeth. These weren't just political opponents, they were sisters who had been pitted against each other by their father's cruelty for their entire lives. Mary had watched Henry VIII destroy Elizabeth's mother the same way he had destroyed Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon. In Mary's mind, Elizabeth wasn't the enemy. Elizabeth was another victim who just needed to be saved from the Protestant heresy that was corrupting her soul. And Mary was absolutely convinced that the best way to save Elizabeth's soul was to either convert her to Catholicism or burn her alive, preferably the former, but she was perfectly willing to settle for the latter. The evidence of Mary's twisted affection for Elizabeth is preserved in their correspondence, and it's honestly chilling to read. There's this letter Mary wrote to Elizabeth just weeks after becoming queen, where she says, "My dearest sister, I know that the poison of false religion has been fed to you since childhood, but I believe with proper guidance and sincere repentance, your soul can still be cleansed. I pray daily for your conversion, for I could not bear to see you suffer the eternal torments that await all heretics." Translation: convert to Catholicism or I'll have you burned alive. But either way, I'm doing this because I love you. Elizabeth, reading this letter, must have realized that she was dealing with something far more dangerous than simple political ambition. Mary wasn't just threatening Elizabeth's life. She was threatening it from a position of moral certainty. And there's nothing more dangerous than a fanatic who genuinely believes they're saving you. But Elizabeth had learned something crucial from her years of surviving in hostile environments. The most dangerous opponents were often the ones who underestimated you. And Mary, despite all her political experience, was about to make that exact mistake. Because Mary looked at Elizabeth and saw what she expected to see: a young, inexperienced girl who had been raised in Protestant heresy, but could still be molded into a proper Catholic lady. Mary had no idea that she was actually dealing with one of the most psychologically sophisticated political operators in European history. Elizabeth's first move was pure genius. Instead of openly defying Mary's religious demands, she began what can only be described as the most elaborate performance in Tudor history. When Mary summoned Elizabeth to court and demanded that she attend Catholic Mass, Elizabeth didn't refuse, but she also didn't simply comply. Instead, she showed up to Mass looking visibly ill, complaining of stomach pains and headaches whenever Catholic rituals were performed. The Spanish ambassador, Simon Renard, wrote to his king describing Elizabeth's behavior during these services. The Lady Elizabeth appears to suffer great physical distress during the sacred ceremonies. She holds her stomach and winces as though in pain. Yet when the service ends, her health seems to improve remarkably. Elizabeth was essentially claiming that Catholicism made her physically sick, but doing it in a way that could be interpreted as either genuine religious rejection or medical issues beyond her control. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. But Mary wasn't stupid. She recognized that Elizabeth was playing games, and she decided to up the stakes. In early 1554, she began pressuring Elizabeth to make a public conversion to Catholicism, complete with a formal ceremony renouncing her Protestant beliefs. This is where Elizabeth's childhood trauma actually became her salvation. Because all those years of being legally erased, of having to prove her worth through performance, had taught her exactly how to give people what they wanted to hear without actually giving them what they wanted. Elizabeth's response to Mary's conversion demands was a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. She told Mary that she was earnestly studying Catholic doctrine and praying for divine guidance about her religious future. She attended more Catholic services, met with Catholic priests, even commissioned Catholic books for her library. But if you read her letters from this period carefully, you'll notice something brilliant. Elizabeth never actually committed to anything. Every statement was conditional. Every promise was hedged. Every gesture of Catholic sympathy was accompanied by requests for more time to properly understand these weighty matters. She was buying time while appearing to cooperate. And Mary, desperate to believe in Elizabeth's potential conversion, chose to interpret these delays as spiritual progress rather than political maneuvering. But Elizabeth's greatest stroke of genius during this period was how she used Mary's own psychology against her. See, Mary had spent most of her adult life feeling like a victim, stripped of her legitimacy by her father, denied her rightful place as queen for years, forced to watch Protestant reforms tear apart the Catholic England she loved. Mary's entire identity was built around the idea that she was God's chosen instrument to restore England to the true faith. Elizabeth figured out how to make Mary feel like a successful savior rather than a frustrated persecutor. She began writing letters to Mary expressing gratitude for her patient guidance and sisterly care. She would ask Mary for recommendations of Catholic books to study, for advice about spiritual matters, for permission to meet with Catholic scholars. There's this incredible letter Elizabeth wrote to Mary in late 1554, where she says, "Your Majesty's loving instruction has opened my eyes to many truths I had not previously understood. I find myself questioning beliefs I once held dear, and yearning for the spiritual certainty that your faith provides. On the surface, this sounds like Elizabeth is on the verge of conversion. But read it again. She's not actually saying she believes anything. She's saying she's questioning her old beliefs and yearning for certainty. It's completely empty of actual commitment while sounding deeply spiritual." Mary was so excited by this apparent progress that she began showing Elizabeth's letters to foreign ambassadors as proof that Protestant England was returning to the Catholic fold. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was using the access these performances gave her to gather intelligence about Mary's plans, her weaknesses, her supporters, and enemies. But the real test came in February 1554, when Thomas Wyatt led a Protestant rebellion against Mary's planned marriage to Philip II of Spain. And Elizabeth found herself in the most dangerous position of her life because Wyatt's rebels had used Elizabeth's name as a rallying cry, claiming they were fighting to put the true Protestant princess on the throne instead of the Catholic usurper Mary. Elizabeth had nothing to do with the rebellion. She was far too smart to get involved in something so obviously doomed to failure. But that didn't matter. Mary was convinced that Elizabeth must have been involved, and she ordered her sister arrested on charges of treason. This was it. The moment Elizabeth had been preparing for her entire life. If she made one wrong move, said one wrong word, showed even a hint of the strategic brilliance she'd been hiding, she would be following her mother to the executioner's block. But Elizabeth was ready. When the Earl of Sussex arrived at Hatfield House with orders to arrest her, Elizabeth's response was perfect. She didn't protest her innocence too strongly. That would have seemed suspicious. She didn't break down in tears. That would have seemed weak. Instead, she expressed confusion and concern, like someone who genuinely didn't understand what she could possibly have done wrong. There's a record of her conversation with Sussex where she says, "My lord, I am greatly troubled by these accusations, for I cannot conceive how I might have given offense to her majesty, who has shown me such kindness. I pray that this matter might be resolved quickly, for I would not have my sister believe I am capable of ingratitude or disloyalty. Perfect psychological positioning. She's expressing loyalty to Mary personally, while subtly reminding everyone that accusations against her reflect poorly on Mary's judgment. But the real genius was what Elizabeth did during the journey to the Tower of London, where Anne Boleyn had been executed 18 years earlier. Instead of trying to hide or escape, Elizabeth turned her arrest into a public relations triumph. She rode through London in an open litter, dressed in white, the color of innocence and martyrdom, waving to the crowds that gathered to watch. The Spanish ambassador wrote that the people received her with great sympathy, many calling out blessings and expressions of support. Elizabeth was transforming herself from an accused traitor into a persecuted innocent in the eyes of the public. And when she arrived at the Tower, she did something that showed incredible psychological courage. She refused to enter through the Traitor's Gate, the water entrance where condemned prisoners were traditionally brought. Instead, she demanded to be allowed to walk through the main entrance like a person of royal blood. It was a tiny gesture, but symbolically enormous. Elizabeth was refusing to accept the role of condemned prisoner that Mary was trying to force on her. What happened next, during Elizabeth's 2 months of imprisonment in the Tower, would prove that the broken child who had once been legally erased had become something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined, and the psychological game she played during those terrifying weeks would lay the groundwork for one of the most brilliant political comebacks in history. Locked inside the same tower where her mother had been murdered, Elizabeth Tudor was about to pull off the most audacious psychological manipulation in English history. March 1554. The stone walls of the Tower of London had witnessed countless executions, but they had never seen anything like what 20-year-old Elizabeth was about to do. She was going to turn her own prison into a stage, her captivity into a performance, and her potential execution into a political comeback that would echo through the centuries. But first, she had to survive the interrogations, because Mary Tudor wasn't just keeping Elizabeth locked up for show, she was conducting a systematic investigation to find evidence of treason. And the investigators Mary sent to the Tower were professionals who had broken much more experienced prisoners than a 20-year-old princess. The interrogation records preserved in the state papers at the National Archives reveal a psychological chess match between Elizabeth and some of the most skilled interrogators in Europe. And reading them today, you can watch a masterclass in how to survive when everyone wants you dead. The lead investigator was Sir Thomas Pope, a man who had successfully prosecuted dozens of high-profile treason cases. His strategy was simple but effective: wear down the prisoner through repetitive questioning, catch them in contradictions, then use those contradictions to build a case for execution. But Elizabeth had been preparing for this moment her entire life. When Pope asked her about her relationship with Thomas Wyatt, the rebel leader who had used her name, Elizabeth's response was perfect. She didn't claim complete ignorance, which would have been obviously false. Instead, she acknowledged knowing Wyatt socially while expressing shock and horror at his treasonous activities. Here's part of her actual testimony. "I have indeed been acquainted with Master Wyatt, as one might know any gentleman of good family at court, but I am greatly grieved to learn of his treasonous actions, which I could never have imagined from our brief and proper conversations." Notice the psychological sophistication here. She's admitting to a connection that the investigators already know about, which makes her seem honest. but she's framing that connection in the most innocent possible terms while expressing appropriate moral outrage at Wyatt's actions. But Pope wasn't done. He began pressing Elizabeth about specific conversations, specific meetings, specific letters. And here's where Elizabeth's childhood trauma actually became her greatest weapon. Because all those years of watching adults lie to her, of learning to read between the lines, of understanding that everyone had hidden motives, all of that had made Elizabeth incredibly good at recognizing interrogation tactics. When Pope would ask the same question multiple ways, trying to catch her in a contradiction, Elizabeth would respond with slight variations that maintained consistency while showing she understood what he was doing. When he would try to trick her with false information, claiming that other prisoners had already confessed to her involvement, Elizabeth would express concern for those prisoners' souls while maintaining her own innocence. Most brilliantly, when Pope would try to make her angry or emotional, hoping she would blurt out something incriminating, Elizabeth would respond with what can only be described as supernatural calm. There's this incredible moment in the interrogation records where Pope accuses Elizabeth of being too composed for someone facing execution. He says something like, "Your ladyship seems remarkably serene for one in such dire circumstances." Elizabeth's response was pure genius. "My lord, I have learned that agitation serves no purpose save to cloud one's judgment. If I am innocent, as I believe myself to be, then God's will shall prevail. If I am guilty of crimes I cannot recall, then perhaps this trial will help me understand my errors." Think about the psychology of that answer. She's positioning herself as someone who is either completely innocent or so confused that she doesn't even understand her own guilt. Either way, she's not a calculating traitor worthy of execution. But the real masterpiece of Elizabeth's Tower strategy wasn't what she said during the interrogations. It was what she did between them. Because Elizabeth understood something that most prisoners didn't. The Tower of London wasn't just a prison, it was a stage. And everyone in London was watching to see how the drama would unfold. So Elizabeth began conducting what can only be described as a public relations campaign from inside her cell. She started by befriending her guards, not through bribery or seduction, but through simple human kindness. She would ask about their families, express concern for their well-being, treat them with respect despite her circumstances. This had two brilliant effects. First, it made the guards more likely to treat her well and speak positively about her to others. Second, it demonstrated to anyone watching that Elizabeth was maintaining her humanity and dignity despite being imprisoned. But the real stroke of genius was how Elizabeth used her daily walks in the Tower Gardens. Prisoners were allowed brief exercise periods under guard, and Elizabeth turned these walks into carefully choreographed performances. She would walk slowly, gracefully, always maintaining perfect posture. She would stop to smell flowers, to feed birds, to speak kindly to servants. Word of these walks spread throughout London, creating an image of Elizabeth as a serene, noble figure bearing her persecution with grace. People began gathering outside the Tower walls just to catch a glimpse of her during her exercise periods. The Spanish ambassador wrote to his king about this phenomenon. "The Lady Elizabeth has somehow transformed her imprisonment into a kind of martyrdom. The people speak of her with increasing sympathy, and there are murmurs that she is being treated unjustly." Elizabeth was winning the propaganda war from inside her prison cell. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated thing Elizabeth did during her imprisonment was how she managed her relationship with Mary Tudor herself, because Mary was deeply conflicted about what to do with Elizabeth. Part of her wanted to execute the sister she saw as a threat to Catholic England, but another part of her genuinely loved Elizabeth and hoped for her conversion and redemption. Elizabeth understood this psychological conflict, and she exploited it brilliantly. She began sending letters to Mary that were masterpieces of emotional manipulation, not obvious manipulation. Elizabeth was far too smart for that. Instead, she wrote letters that appeared to be sincere expressions of sisterly affection, while subtly reinforcing Mary's internal conflict. Here's an excerpt from one of these letters. Your Majesty, I find myself daily in prayer, not only for my own soul, but for yours as well. I am deeply grieved that my presence should cause you distress when my only desire is to be worthy of the love you have shown me since childhood. Notice what Elizabeth is doing here. She's positioning herself as someone who loves Mary and is suffering because she's causing Mary pain. She's making Mary feel guilty for imprisoning her, while also suggesting that Elizabeth is becoming more religious during her captivity. It's psychological manipulation of the highest order, but done so subtly that Mary probably wasn't even conscious of being manipulated. And it worked. After 2 months of investigation, the prosecutors had found no evidence of treason against Elizabeth. More importantly, Mary was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with keeping her sister imprisoned without clear proof of guilt. In May 1554, Elizabeth was released from the Tower, but she wasn't freed. She was transferred to house arrest at Woodstock Palace under the supervision of Sir Henry Bedingfield. And that's where Elizabeth's psychological warfare reached its peak. Because Bedingfield was a devoted Catholic who saw Elizabeth's supervision as a sacred duty. Mary had chosen him specifically because she thought he would be immune to Elizabeth's charms. She was wrong. Elizabeth's strategy with Bedingfield was different from anything she had tried before. Instead of trying to charm or manipulate him directly, she began what can only be described as a campaign of calculated vulnerability. She would ask Bedingfield for advice about religious matters, expressing confusion and seeking guidance. She would request books about Catholic theology, claiming she wanted to understand Mary's faith better. She would even ask Bedingfield to pray with her, saying she felt lost and needed spiritual direction. Bedingfield, despite his instructions to remain suspicious of Elizabeth, found himself becoming genuinely concerned for her spiritual welfare. His reports to Mary began expressing hope that Elizabeth was moving toward conversion. But the real genius of Elizabeth's strategy was that she was learning while she performed. Every conversation with Catholic theologians, every religious text she studied, every prayer session with Bedingfield was gathering intelligence about Catholic doctrine and practice that she would later use to navigate Mary's court. By the time Elizabeth was finally allowed to return to court in 1555, she had transformed herself from a suspected traitor into what appeared to be a potential Catholic convert. She had turned her imprisonment into an education, her persecution into a performance, and her near execution into a political triumph. But the most dangerous phase of Elizabeth's survival was just beginning, because Mary Tudor was about to launch the bloodiest religious persecution in English history, and Elizabeth would need every psychological weapon she had developed to navigate the reign of terror that was coming. The woman who had learned to survive in a prison was about to discover what it meant to survive in a kingdom where the wrong prayer could get you burned alive. Smoke was rising from every corner of England, and the screams of the dying echoed through the streets of London. February 1555. Mary Tudor had just launched the most systematic religious persecution in English history, and 21-year-old Elizabeth found herself walking a tightrope suspended over an inferno of fanaticism. In the span of 3 years, Mary would burn nearly 300 Protestants alive, and Elizabeth, the most famous Protestant in England, had to find a way to survive in a kingdom where her very existence was considered an act of heresy. What she did next would prove that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about maintaining your soul while everyone around you loses theirs. The statistics alone are horrifying. Between 1555 and 1558, Mary's government executed 283 Protestant heretics by burning them alive at the stake. That's roughly 2 executions every week for 3 years straight. But these weren't random killings. They were carefully orchestrated public spectacles designed to terrorize the population into religious conformity. And Elizabeth had to attend them because Mary didn't just want Elizabeth to survive. She wanted Elizabeth to participate, to watch, to learn what happened to people who refused to embrace the Catholic faith. There's a chilling account from the Venetian ambassador describing Elizabeth's demeanor at one of these executions. He writes, "The Lady Elizabeth stands perfectly still throughout the proceedings, her face composed, showing neither approval nor distress. It is impossible to discern her true feelings, though one suspects she stores every detail in her memory for future use." A 21-year-old woman watching people burn alive and treating it like a political education. That's not normal human behavior. That's the psychology of someone who's learned to compartmentalize trauma in order to survive. But Elizabeth's real genius during this period wasn't just her ability to endure these horrors. It was how she used them to her advantage. Because while Mary thought she was terrorizing Elizabeth into conversion, Elizabeth was actually conducting a master class in how to read political winds. She was studying how persecution worked, how fear operated, how people responded to terror, and she was taking notes. There's a fascinating letter Elizabeth wrote to her friend Roger Ascham during this period, where she makes an observation that shows just how analytically she was approaching Mary's reign of terror. She writes, "I have observed that extreme measures, while they may compel outward compliance, often create inward resistance that grows stronger with each excess." A 21-year-old developing a theory about the psychology of political oppression while living under a government that could burn her alive at any moment, that's not just survival, that's strategic intelligence gathering. But Elizabeth's most brilliant move during the Marian persecutions was how she managed her own religious performance. Because Elizabeth understood something that most of Mary's victims didn't. Martyrdom might be noble, but it was also stupid if you had other options. So instead of openly defying Mary's religious demands, Elizabeth began what can only be described as the most sophisticated theological performance in Tudor history. She started attending Mass regularly, but not enthusiastically. She would arrive precisely on time, participate in all the required rituals, but do so with what observers described as dutiful resignation rather than joyful devotion. The Spanish ambassador Simon Renard wrote extensively about Elizabeth's behavior during this period, and his reports reveal someone who was threading an incredibly narrow psychological needle. He describes Elizabeth as compliant but not convinced, obedient but not converted. This was perfect positioning. Elizabeth was giving Mary just enough cooperation to avoid accusation of heresy, but not so much enthusiasm that she would be trapped if the political situation changed. But the real masterpiece of Elizabeth's strategy was how she used her relationship with Philip II of Spain, Mary's new husband. Because Philip, unlike Mary, wasn't motivated by religious fanaticism. He was a calculating politician who understood that burning the potential heir to the English throne might not be the smartest long-term strategy. Elizabeth began cultivating a careful relationship with Philip, not through direct communication that would have been too dangerous, but through intermediaries and subtle signals. She would make sure that Philip heard about her progress in religious matters. She would ask Spanish courtiers for recommendations about Catholic texts to study. She would express admiration for Spanish culture and learning. Most brilliantly, she began speaking Spanish at court functions, demonstrating her respect for Philip's heritage while also showing off the intellectual abilities that Catherine Parr had cultivated. There's a record from the Imperial Ambassador describing a dinner where Elizabeth engaged in theological discussion with Spanish priests in fluent Spanish. He writes, "Her ladyship demonstrates remarkable knowledge of Catholic doctrine, though one suspects her understanding is more intellectual than spiritual." Elizabeth was showing Philip that she was valuable, intelligent, educated, potentially useful, while maintaining just enough distance from actual conversion to preserve her options. And it worked. Philip began subtly protecting Elizabeth from Mary's more extreme impulses, not because he cared about her welfare, but because he recognized her political value. But Elizabeth's psychological survival during this period required more than just political maneuvering. It required her to maintain her sanity while watching her friends and supporters burned alive. And the evidence suggests that Elizabeth came very close to breaking. There's a letter she wrote to her former governess, Cat Ashley, in late 1556 that reveals just how much psychological stress she was under. She writes, "I find myself questioning not only my beliefs, but my very understanding of God's will. How can such cruelty be justified in His name? How can love and terror exist in the same heart?" This isn't the calculating political strategist we've been following. This is a young woman grappling with genuine spiritual and moral crisis. But what saved Elizabeth wasn't her political intelligence. It was something Catherine Parr had taught her years earlier, the understanding that true strength came from maintaining your humanity even when everyone around you was losing theirs. Elizabeth began secretly helping Protestant victims of Mary's persecution. Not openly, that would have been suicide. But through intermediaries, through coded messages, through careful financial support channeled through trusted servants. She couldn't save them from execution, but she could ensure their families were cared for. She couldn't stop the burnings, but she could preserve the names and stories of the victims. There's evidence in the household accounts from Hatfield House showing payments to various poor families that correlate precisely with the dates of Protestant executions. Elizabeth was essentially running an underground welfare system for the families of martyrs. This wasn't just political positioning. This was Elizabeth maintaining her moral compass in a world that had gone insane. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated thing Elizabeth did during Mary's reign was how she prepared for the future. Because Elizabeth understood something that Mary didn't. Terror campaigns always end. And when they do, the survivors remember who helped them and who abandoned them. So while Mary was busy burning Protestants, Elizabeth was quietly building relationships with the Protestant underground that would survive Mary's persecution. She would receive visitors at Hatfield House who claimed to be seeking religious guidance, but were actually Protestant leaders maintaining communication networks. She would send coded letters expressing concern for the spiritual welfare of troubled souls that were really intelligence updates for Protestant resistance groups. Most importantly, she began developing the political philosophy that would later define her reign. The idea that religious unity was less important than national stability. The tolerance was more effective than persecution, that a queen's job was to protect all her subjects, not just the ones who shared her beliefs. There's a remarkable letter Elizabeth wrote near the end of Mary's reign where she outlines this philosophy. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. Better to have unity and loyalty than uniformity and faith, for subjects who trust their ruler's justice will serve more faithfully than those who fear her wrath. This was revolutionary thinking for the 16th century. Elizabeth was essentially arguing for religious tolerance 50 years before it became fashionable among European intellectuals. But Mary's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The queen who had tried to save England's soul through fire was dying, probably of ovarian cancer, though her physicians couldn't be sure. And as Mary weakened, Elizabeth prepared for the moment that would change everything. Because when Mary Tudor died, Elizabeth wouldn't just inherit a crown. She would inherit a kingdom torn apart by religious hatred, a treasury emptied by war, and a people traumatized by 3 years of systematic terror. The broken child who'd learned to survive in the shadows was about to discover what it meant to rule in the light. The bells were ringing across London, but this time they weren't announcing another execution. November 17th, 1558. Mary Tudor was dead, and 25-year-old Elizabeth Tudor was about to inherit the most poisoned chalice in European politics, the crown of England. But here's what's absolutely incredible about this moment. While most new monarchs would be terrified by the challenges facing them, Elizabeth had been preparing for exactly this scenario her entire life. Every trauma, every betrayal, every near-death experience had been training for what happened next. And what happened next would prove that sometimes the most broken people make the strongest leaders. The England Elizabeth inherited was an absolute disaster. The royal treasury was bankrupt. Mary had spent everything on her religious persecutions and her disastrous war with France. The country was divided along religious lines so bitter that neighbors were literally burning neighbors alive. England's international reputation was in ruins, with most European powers viewing the country as either a Catholic puppet state or a Protestant pariah. And, oh, by the way, Elizabeth was still legally illegitimate in the eyes of many, still unmarried with no heirs, and still the target of multiple assassination plots. Most people would have looked at the situation and run screaming. Elizabeth looked at it and saw opportunity because Elizabeth understood something that most politicians don't. Chaos creates possibility. When everything is broken, you have the freedom to rebuild it according to your own vision. And Elizabeth's vision was revolutionary. Her coronation on January 15th, 1559 was the first clue that something unprecedented was happening. Instead of the traditional solemn religious ceremony, Elizabeth turned her coronation into a carefully choreographed piece of political theater designed to send messages to multiple audiences simultaneously. The ceremony itself was Protestant, which satisfied her Protestant supporters. But Elizabeth invited Catholic nobles to attend and made sure they were treated with respect, which signaled that she wasn't planning a vindictive persecution of Catholics. Most brilliantly, Elizabeth designed her coronation procession through London to be a massive public relations event. She stopped to speak with common people, accepted flowers from children, and even paused to listen to a choir of school children sing her praises. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Her Majesty conducts herself not as a distant sovereign, but as one who genuinely delights in her people's affection. Elizabeth was establishing a new model of monarchy, one based on popular appeal rather than just divine right. But the real genius of Elizabeth's early reign wasn't the pageantry. It was the psychological warfare she conducted against her own government. Because Elizabeth inherited a privy council full of men who expected to control a young, inexperienced female ruler. These were politicians who had survived Henry VIII's reign, Edward VIII's minority, and Mary's religious extremism by being adaptable, ruthless, and extremely good at reading power dynamics. They thought they understood exactly what kind of Queen Elizabeth would be, a figurehead who would rely on their wisdom and experience while they made the real decisions. They were spectacularly wrong. Elizabeth's first Privy Council meeting is preserved in the state papers, and reading the transcript is like watching a masterclass in psychological dominance. Instead of deferring to the experienced politicians around her, Elizabeth began by asking each counselor to explain their position on the major issues facing the kingdom. But here's the brilliant part. She wasn't asking for their advice. She was testing their knowledge, their reasoning, their hidden agendas. When Secretary of State William Cecil presented her with a complex analysis of England's foreign policy challenges, Elizabeth didn't just nod and accept his recommendations. Instead, she began asking questions that revealed she had already done her own analysis and reached different conclusions. She asked about specific details that Cecil hadn't mentioned, pointed out potential consequences he hadn't considered, and suggested alternative strategies that demonstrated her understanding was deeper than his. Cecil later wrote to a friend that Her Majesty's mind works with a speed and precision that is both admirable and somewhat terrifying. She sees implications that escape even experienced counselors. Elizabeth was establishing that she wasn't going to be a puppet queen. She was going to be the smartest person in every room. But Elizabeth's most revolutionary decision was how she approached the religious crisis that had torn England apart for the previous 25 years. Because everyone expected her to either continue Mary's Catholic persecution in reverse, burning Catholics instead of Protestants, or to impose such strict Protestant orthodoxy that Catholics would be driven out of the country entirely. Instead, Elizabeth did something unprecedented in 16th century Europe. She chose tolerance. The Elizabethan religious settlement established in 1559 was a masterpiece of political psychology. Instead of demanding that everyone believe the same things, Elizabeth essentially said, "I don't care what you believe privately as long as you're loyal publicly." The famous phrase attributed to Elizabeth, though probably not her exact words, captures the essence of her approach. "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls." This wasn't just political pragmatism, though it was certainly that. This was Elizabeth applying everything she had learned about human psychology during her traumatic childhood. She understood that forcing people to change their deepest beliefs only created resentment and rebellion. She knew that giving people the freedom to maintain their private convictions while requiring public conformity was much more effective than trying to control their thoughts. and the results were immediate and dramatic. Instead of the religious wars that were tearing apart France and Germany, England began to experience something unprecedented: religious peace. But Elizabeth's psychological genius really showed in how she handled the marriage question that dominated the first decade of her reign. Because everyone, and I mean everyone, assumed that Elizabeth would marry quickly and produce heirs to secure the succession. The Privy Council presented her with potential husbands. Foreign ambassadors arrived with marriage proposals from their kings. Parliament literally begged her to choose a husband. Elizabeth's response was to turn the marriage negotiation into the most sophisticated diplomatic tool in European history. Instead of refusing marriage outright, which would have ended the diplomatic value, Elizabeth began entertaining multiple suitors simultaneously. She would negotiate seriously with the Archduke Charles of Austria, while also considering proposals from King Eric XIV of Sweden and maintaining a flirtation with Robert Dudley, her childhood friend. Each negotiation gave England diplomatic leverage with different European powers. The possibility of an Austrian marriage gave her influence with the Holy Roman Empire. The Swedish option provided a counterweight to French power. The Dudley romance kept her domestic nobility invested in her decisions. Most brilliantly, Elizabeth used these marriage negotiations to buy time while she consolidated her power and proved that she could rule effectively as an unmarried woman. There's this incredible letter from the French ambassador describing his frustration with trying to pin Elizabeth down on marriage. He writes, "Her Majesty speaks of marriage as though it were the most important decision of her life. Yet somehow every negotiation ends with new conditions that must be considered, new complications that must be resolved. Elizabeth was essentially running a con game on the entire European diplomatic establishment, and they fell for it completely. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated thing Elizabeth did during her early reign was how she transformed her greatest weakness, being an unmarried female ruler in a patriarchal society, into her greatest strength. Instead of apologizing for her gender or trying to act like a man, Elizabeth began cultivating what historians call the cult of the Virgin Queen. She positioned herself as married to England, with her subjects as her children. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was revolutionary political psychology. Elizabeth was creating a new model of female power that didn't depend on masculine authority or sexual relationships. She began appearing in public wearing white gowns that emphasized her virginity, carrying symbols of purity and wisdom. Her portraits from this period show her holding books, globes, and other symbols of learning and authority. Most importantly, she began speaking about her relationship with England in terms that were both maternal and mystical. In one famous speech to Parliament, she said, "Though God has raised me high, yet this I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves." Elizabeth was creating an entirely new archetype, the powerful woman who derived authority not from men, but from her own relationship with her people and her country. And it was working. By 1560, just 2 years into her reign, Elizabeth had stabilized England's finances, ended the religious persecutions, established diplomatic relationships across Europe, and begun what would become the English Renaissance. But Elizabeth's greatest challenge was still ahead, because while she'd been building her domestic power and international reputation, the most dangerous woman in Europe had been plotting her destruction. Mary, Queen of Scots, was about to return from France with a claim to Elizabeth's throne and the backing of Catholic Europe. The survival skills Elizabeth had learned as a child were about to be tested against an enemy who was everything she wasn't: legitimate, beautiful, and absolutely ruthless in her ambitions. Chess masters know that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who attacks you directly. It's the one who forces you to destroy yourself. August 1561. Mary, Queen of Scots, had just returned from France, and Elizabeth Tudor was about to face the most psychologically complex challenge of her reign. Because Mary wasn't just another political rival, she was everything Elizabeth wasn't supposed to be: legitimately born, classically beautiful, raised as a queen from birth, and backed by the most powerful Catholic nations in Europe. Mary was also Elizabeth's cousin, which meant their conflict would be both personal and political. And here's the terrifying part: Mary actually had a better legal claim to the English throne than Elizabeth did. But what Mary didn't understand was that she was about to enter a psychological chess match with someone who'd been playing survival games since she was 2 years old. And Elizabeth was about to demonstrate that sometimes the best way to defeat a perfect enemy is to let them defeat themselves. The contrast between these two queens couldn't have been more dramatic. Mary Stuart was 18 years old, nearly 6 feet tall, stunningly beautiful, and had spent her entire life being told she was destined for greatness. She spoke perfect French, danced like a professional, and could charm any man in Europe. Elizabeth was 28, average height, intelligent rather than beautiful, and had spent her entire life learning that survival depended on never trusting anyone completely. Most historians focus on their political differences: Catholic versus Protestant, legitimate versus illegitimate, French-backed versus independent. But the real conflict was psychological. Mary represented everything the traditional society said a queen should be. Elizabeth represented something entirely new. And Elizabeth understood that she couldn't compete with Mary on Mary's terms, so she changed the game entirely. Elizabeth's first move was pure genius. Instead of treating Mary as an enemy, she began corresponding with her as a beloved cousin. The letters between Elizabeth and Mary from 1561 to 1563 are preserved in the British Library, and they are masterpieces of diplomatic manipulation disguised as family affection. Elizabeth would write things like, "My dearest cousin, I rejoice in your safe return to Scotland and pray that your reign brings you the happiness and success that your noble character deserves." On the surface, that's just polite royal correspondence. But psychologically, Elizabeth was doing something brilliant. She was positioning herself as the experienced older cousin offering guidance to the younger relative, which subtly established a hierarchy even while expressing affection. But the real masterstroke was how Elizabeth handled Mary's marriage prospects. Because Mary needed to marry to secure her position, and every potential husband came with political implications. If she married a Catholic prince, it would threaten Protestant England. If she married a Protestant noble, it would anger Catholic Europe. If she married a powerful foreign king, it would make Scotland a puppet state. Elizabeth offered to help Mary choose a husband, and her suggestion was absolutely diabolical. Elizabeth proposed that Mary marry Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's own favorite courtier, and the man many people thought Elizabeth herself would marry. Think about the psychology of that offer. Elizabeth was essentially saying, "Here, cousin, you can have the man I love most in the world because your happiness is more important to me than my own." It was presented as an act of supreme generosity, but it was actually psychological warfare of the highest order. First, It put Mary in an impossible position. If she accepted Dudley, she would be acknowledging that Elizabeth had the right to choose Scotland's future king consort. If she refused, she would appear ungrateful and suspicious of Elizabeth's motives. Second, it created doubt about Elizabeth's own marriage plans. If Elizabeth was willing to give up Dudley, what were her real intentions? Was she secretly planning to marry someone else? Was she actually committed to remaining unmarried? Third, and most cleverly, it established Elizabeth as the puppet master of European marriage diplomacy. Other foreign princes would have to wonder, if Elizabeth could offer her own favorite to Scotland, what other matrimonial combinations might she be orchestrating? Mary's response revealed that she understood the trap, but couldn't figure out how to escape it. She wrote back expressing gratitude for Elizabeth's sisterly concern, while politely declining the suggestion and asking for Elizabeth's advice about other potential suitors. Elizabeth had successfully positioned herself as Mary's marriage counselor, which gave her intelligence about Mary's romantic and political plans while maintaining the fiction of family harmony. But Elizabeth's most brilliant psychological weapon against Mary was something Mary couldn't have anticipated: Elizabeth's relationship with the English people. Because Mary had been raised in the French court, where royal authority was absolute and popular opinion was irrelevant. She understood power as something that flowed downward from the monarch to the subjects. Elizabeth had learned the opposite lesson. Her traumatic childhood had taught her that power was unstable, that survival depended on building coalitions, and that even queens needed allies. So, while Mary was focused on international diplomacy and noble alliances, Elizabeth was conducting a revolutionary experiment in royal public relations. She began what modern politicians would recognize as a systematic campaign to build brand loyalty among the English people. Elizabeth would go on royal progresses, elaborate tours through the countryside, where she would stay in the homes of ordinary nobles and merchants rather than just grand palaces. These progresses weren't just ceremonial. They were intelligence-gathering operations. Elizabeth would learn about local concerns, economic problems, religious tensions, and popular attitudes toward her rule. More importantly, she would address these concerns directly. If a region was suffering from poor harvests, Elizabeth would arrange for grain shipments. If local Protestant ministers were being harassed, she would quietly transfer them to safer positions. If Catholic families were being persecuted by overzealous Protestant officials, she would intervene to protect them. The Spanish ambassador wrote to Philip II, describing Elizabeth's growing popularity. The Queen has somehow convinced her subjects that their welfare is her personal concern. They speak of her not as a distant sovereign, but as a protector who understands their daily struggles. Elizabeth was building something unprecedented in European politics, a monarchy based on genuine popular support rather than just fear and tradition. Meanwhile, Mary was making the opposite mistake. Her early decisions as Queen of Scotland alienated exactly the people she needed most: the Protestant Scottish nobles who controlled the country's real power. Mary insisted on hearing Catholic Mass in her private chapel, which wasn't technically illegal, but sent a clear signal about her religious preferences. She filled her court with French advisors rather than Scottish ones. Most fatally, she began making statements suggesting that her claim to the English throne was superior to Elizabeth's. These weren't necessarily wrong decisions from a legal or religious perspective, but they were psychological disasters that played directly into Elizabeth's hands. because every time Mary emphasized her Catholicism, Elizabeth looked more like a unifying Protestant alternative. Every time Mary relied on French support, Elizabeth appeared more genuinely English. Every time Mary asserted her superior claim to the English throne, Elizabeth could position herself as the humble servant of her people rather than an ambitious usurper. But Elizabeth's masterstroke came in 1565, when Mary made the decision that would ultimately destroy her. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was handsome, charming, and had Tudor blood through his mother, which strengthened Mary's claim to the English succession. On paper, it was a brilliant political marriage. In reality, it was psychological suicide, because Darnley was also vain, jealous, alcoholic, and probably mentally unstable. Within months of the marriage, he was demanding to be named King of Scotland rather than just Mary's consort. He was alienating Scottish nobles with his arrogance. Most dangerously, he was becoming violently jealous of Mary's secretary and rumored lover, David Rizzio. Elizabeth watched this disaster unfold with what can only be described as professional appreciation. She sent Mary congratulations on her marriage, while privately expressing concern to Scottish nobles about Darnley's unfortunate temperament. She was essentially providing psychological support to Mary's enemies while maintaining the appearance of family loyalty. The trap was set. Mary was married to a man who was destroying her political position while strengthening Elizabeth's claim to represent stability and wisdom. And then, on March 9, 1566, the psychological warfare became literal warfare when Darnley and his conspirators brutally murdered David Rizzio in front of the pregnant Mary. What happened next would prove that Elizabeth had been playing a much longer game than anyone realized, and Mary, Queen of Scots, was about to discover that the cousin who had seemed so supportive was actually her most dangerous enemy. Blood was about to flow in the most spectacular royal scandal of the 16th century, and Elizabeth Tudor had a front-row seat to watch her rival destroy herself. February 10th, 1567. Lord Darnley, Mary Queen of Scots' husband, was murdered in an explosion that could be heard across Edinburgh. But here's what makes this moment absolutely extraordinary. Elizabeth had been quietly orchestrating the conditions that would lead to this disaster for over 2 years without ever directly plotting against Mary. Elizabeth had created a psychological environment where Mary's self-destruction was almost inevitable. And what happened next would prove that the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones who attack you. They're the ones who help you defeat yourself. The murder of Lord Darnley wasn't just a political assassination. It was the culmination of one of the most sophisticated psychological manipulation campaigns in history. And Elizabeth's fingerprints were all over it, even though she never gave a single direct order. Here's how diabolical Elizabeth's strategy really was. Instead of trying to destroy Mary through military force or diplomatic pressure, Elizabeth had identified Mary's greatest weakness, her need to be loved, and her terrible judgment about men. So Elizabeth began what can only be described as a systematic campaign to surround Mary with exactly the wrong kind of people. Take James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the man who would ultimately destroy Mary's reputation forever. Bothwell was charming, ambitious, ruthless, and completely immoral. He was also exactly the kind of dangerous man that Mary found irresistible. And how did Bothwell rise to power in Mary's court? through a series of Elizabeth's innocent diplomatic interventions. When Bothwell was accused of various crimes against Scottish nobles, Elizabeth's ambassadors would quietly suggest that perhaps these were political persecutions rather than legitimate justice. When Mary needed military support against rebellious lords, Elizabeth would recommend commanders who happened to be Bothwell's allies. Elizabeth never directly promoted Bothwell. She just created conditions where Mary would naturally turn to him for support. The correspondence between Elizabeth and Mary during this period is preserved in the British Library, and reading it today is like watching a master manipulator at work. Elizabeth would write things like, "I understand that certain Scottish lords question your choice of advisers. How troubling that loyal service should be rewarded with suspicion." She was essentially giving Mary permission to ignore criticism of Bothwell while positioning herself as the understanding friend who supported Mary's judgment. But Elizabeth's real genius was how she handled the Darnley situation. Because by early 1567, everyone knew that Mary's marriage was a disaster. Darnley was drunk most of the time, violent when sober, and actively plotting against Mary's government. Mary was miserable. Her nobles were angry, and Scotland was sliding towards civil war. Most foreign monarchs would have either pressured Mary to reconcile with her husband or suggested that she find a way to legally separate from him. Elizabeth did neither. Instead, she began what can only be described as a campaign of psychological enablement. When Mary wrote to Elizabeth complaining about Darnley's behavior, Elizabeth would respond with sympathy, but no concrete advice. She would say things like, "My heart aches for your suffering, dear cousin. No woman should endure such treatment from one who should protect and cherish her." Elizabeth was validating Mary's anger without suggesting any constructive solutions. She was essentially encouraging Mary to see her situation as unbearable while offering no legal alternatives. And then Elizabeth made what appeared to be an innocent suggestion that was actually psychological dynamite. In a letter dated January 1567, Elizabeth wrote to Mary, "Perhaps if Lord Darnley were to travel abroad for his health, the distance might provide clarity for you both. I have heard that the climate in Italy is excellent for those suffering from various ailments." On the surface, this looks like Elizabeth suggesting a temporary separation. But psychologically, she was planting the idea that Darnley's permanent absence might solve Mary's problems. Mary, desperate and increasingly unstable, began to see elimination rather than separation as her only option. But here's the most chilling part of Elizabeth's strategy. She made sure she had plausible deniability for everything that followed. When Darnley was murdered in that spectacular explosion at Kirko Field, Elizabeth immediately sent letters to Mary expressing shock and offering assistance in finding the perpetrators. She wrote, "I am horrified by this terrible crime against your person and your realm. Please know that England stands ready to assist in bringing these villains to justice." Elizabeth was positioning herself as Mary's protector, while everyone else was positioning themselves as her accusers. Because the murder of Darnley wasn't just scandalous, it was incredibly suspicious. The official story was that gunpowder stored in the house had accidentally exploded, but Darnley's body was found in the garden, apparently strangled with no burns from any explosion. More suspiciously, Mary's behavior after the murder was psychologically catastrophic. Instead of conducting a thorough investigation or maintaining appropriate mourning, she appeared in public wearing bright colors within days of becoming a widow. Worse yet, she began openly favoring Bothwell, the man everyone suspected of organizing the murder. The Scottish nobles were horrified, the common people were scandalized, international observers were aghast, and Elizabeth expressed gentle concern while privately marveling at how perfectly Mary was destroying herself. But Mary wasn't done making catastrophic decisions. 3 months after Darnley's murder, she made the choice that would end her reign forever. She married Bothwell. Not only did she marry the man suspected of murdering her previous husband, but she married him using a Protestant ceremony despite being Catholic, and she did it after Bothwell had allegedly kidnapped and raped her. It was political suicide performed in public. Elizabeth's response to news of Mary's marriage to Bothwell was a masterpiece of diplomatic manipulation. She wrote a letter to Mary that appeared to be supportive while actually being devastating. She said, "My dear cousin, while I pray that your new marriage brings you happiness, I fear that others may not understand the circumstances that led to this union. Perhaps time and patience will soften the harsh judgments of those who do not know your heart as I do." Elizabeth was essentially saying, "I still love you, but everyone else thinks you're a murderous adulteress, and I can't really blame them." The psychological impact on Mary was immediate and catastrophic. Within weeks of this letter, Scottish nobles had risen in rebellion. Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son. Bothwell fled to Denmark, where he would die in prison years later. And Mary made one final desperate gamble that played directly into Elizabeth's hands. She escaped from her Scottish captives and fled to England, throwing herself on Elizabeth's mercy and asking for help in regaining her throne. It was exactly what Elizabeth had been waiting for. Because now, Mary wasn't just a rival with a claim to the English throne. She was a guest, a refugee, a supplicant entirely dependent on Elizabeth's goodwill. Elizabeth could have sent Mary back to Scotland to face her enemies. She could have handed her over to the French. She could have had her quietly murdered and blamed Scottish assassins. Instead, Elizabeth did something far more psychologically sophisticated. She kept Mary as a prisoner disguised as a guest. Mary would spend the next 19 years in comfortable captivity in English country houses, writing letters to foreign princes, plotting Elizabeth's overthrow, and slowly going mad from frustration and isolation. And Elizabeth would use every one of those plots, every desperate scheme, every treasonous letter as further justification for keeping Mary locked away. The woman who had once been Elizabeth's greatest rival had become her most useful political tool. But Elizabeth's treatment of Mary would soon reveal something darker about the queen who had survived so much trauma. Because absolute power, even power gained through brilliant psychological manipulation, has a way of corrupting even the most sympathetic victims. And what Elizabeth would eventually do to Mary, Queen of Scots, would prove that sometimes the greatest monsters are created by the cruelest circumstances. Monsters aren't born, they're forged by necessity. February 8th, 1587. Elizabeth Tudor stood at the window of Greenwich Palace, watching the snowfall on the Thames, knowing that in just a few hours she would sign a death warrant that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The warrant was for Mary, Queen of Scots, the woman who'd been her prisoner, her rival, and strangely almost her friend for 19 years. And what Elizabeth was about to do would reveal the darkest truth about survival. Sometimes protecting yourself requires destroying the people you once loved. But here's what makes this moment so psychologically devastating. Elizabeth didn't want to kill Mary. In fact, she had spent nearly 2 decades trying to avoid exactly this decision. The problem was that Mary, even in captivity, had never stopped trying to murder Elizabeth. And Elizabeth's intelligence network had just uncovered a plot so dangerous, so well-funded, and so close to success that even the queen who had survived every assassination attempt since childhood finally had to admit Mary, Queen of Scots, had to die. The Babington plot, as it came to be known, was the most sophisticated assassination conspiracy in Tudor history. And the evidence against Mary wasn't circumstantial. It was written in her own hand. Here's how completely Mary had underestimated Elizabeth's intelligence capabilities. For 19 years, Mary had been writing letters to foreign princes, Catholic conspirators, and potential rescuers. She thought these letters were being smuggled out secretly by sympathetic servants. What Mary didn't know was that every single letter had been intercepted, decoded, and copied by Elizabeth's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, before being allowed to reach its destination. Elizabeth had been reading Mary's mail for 2 decades. The extent of this surveillance operation is almost unbelievable by modern standards. Walsingham had recruited servants in Mary's household, bribed local postmasters, and developed a network of double agents that stretched across Europe. More importantly, he had developed techniques for opening sealed letters without detection, copying their contents, and resealing them so perfectly that the recipients never suspected they had been intercepted. Elizabeth knew about every plot, every conspiracy, every desperate scheme Mary had attempted. And for 19 years, Elizabeth had chosen to let these plots proceed just far enough to identify all the conspirators before quietly eliminating them. But the Babington plot was different. This time, Mary had agreed to specific plans for Elizabeth's assassination. The evidence is preserved in the National Archives, and it's absolutely damning. In a letter dated July the 17th, 1586, Mary wrote to Anthony Babington, "The affairs being thus prepared, and forces in readiness both within and without the realm, then shall it be time to set the 6 gentlemen to work." The 6 gentlemen were assassins specifically tasked with killing Elizabeth. Mary continued, "When all is ready, the same must be executed with all diligence, seeing that the success of the whole affair depends upon their dispatch and secrecy." There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Mary, Queen of Scots, had explicitly approved a plan to murder Elizabeth Tudor. But here's what's psychologically fascinating about Elizabeth's response to discovering this plot. Instead of immediately ordering Mary's execution, Elizabeth tried one more time to find an alternative. She sent commissioners to interview Mary, hoping that Mary would deny the letters or claim they'd been forged. Elizabeth was essentially giving Mary one last chance to save her own life. Mary's response was devastating in its honesty. She not only confirmed that the letters were authentic, but she justified her actions by claiming that Elizabeth was a usurper who had no right to the English throne. The transcript of this interview preserved in the British Library shows Mary saying, "I came to England seeking the protection of my dear sister. Instead, I found myself imprisoned for crimes I did not commit. If I have sought my freedom through means that others consider treasonous, it is only because I have been driven to desperation by unjust captivity." Mary was essentially arguing that she had the right to conspire against Elizabeth because she disagreed with Elizabeth's authority. Elizabeth's psychological response to this confrontation reveals just how much the broken child had changed over the decades. Because the Elizabeth who had once desperately sought approval and affection from authority figures was gone, replaced by someone who understood that mercy could be a fatal weakness. There are records of Elizabeth's private conversations with her closest advisors during this period, and they show a woman wrestling with the most difficult decision of her life. William Cecil, her longtime counselor, reported that Elizabeth said, "I find myself torn between the woman who remembers what it means to be vulnerable and the queen who knows what survival requires. Mary is my cousin, my fellow queen, my sister in suffering, but she is also my would-be murderer." Elizabeth spent weeks delaying the decision, hoping for some alternative that would protect England without requiring Mary's death. But her advisors made it clear that there was no middle ground. As long as Mary lived, she would be a rallying point for Catholic conspiracies. As long as Mary lived, foreign powers would have a legitimate alternative to Elizabeth. As long as she lived, Elizabeth's own life would be in constant danger. The psychological pressure Elizabeth was under during this period was enormous. Parliament was demanding Mary's execution. Her Privy Council was united in believing that Mary had to die. Foreign ambassadors were reporting that their governments expected decisive action. But Elizabeth had learned something during her traumatic childhood that her advisors didn't understand. Killing people changed you. And Elizabeth wasn't sure she wanted to become the kind of person who executed family members for political convenience. The final psychological blow came when Elizabeth learned about Mary's behavior during her trial. Because Mary had refused to recognize the legitimacy of an English court to try a Scottish queen, she had conducted herself with dignity, intelligence, and remarkable composure throughout the proceedings. In other words, Mary had acted exactly the way Elizabeth herself would have acted in the same situation. The transcripts show Mary saying things like, "I am no subject of yours. I am your equal in royal blood, and I will not submit to the judgment of those who have no authority over me." Elizabeth, reading these transcripts, must have seen herself at age 20 imprisoned in the Tower of London, refusing to accept the role of condemned prisoner. The psychological parallel was inescapable. Elizabeth was about to do to Mary exactly what Henry VIII had done to Anne Boleyn. But there was one crucial difference. Henry VIII had executed Anne Boleyn in a fit of rage and paranoia based on flimsy evidence and political convenience. Elizabeth was executing Mary, Queen of Scots, based on incontrovertible evidence of treason after 19 years of trying to find alternatives as a last resort to protect her kingdom. The death warrant that Elizabeth finally signed on February 1st, 1587, is preserved in the British Library. Her signature is shaky, almost illegible, showing just how much the decision cost her psychologically, but she signed it. And then, in what can only be described as a final act of psychological self-protection, Elizabeth immediately began distancing herself from the consequences of her decision. She sent the warrant to her advisors with instructions that it should be implemented when circumstances require. She didn't specify when or how the execution should be carried out. This gave her plausible deniability if the political situation changed, but it also revealed her desperate hope that somehow, even at the last minute, an alternative might present itself. It didn't. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. Elizabeth's reaction to news of the execution was psychologically complex and deeply revealing. Publicly, she expressed shock and claimed that she had never intended for the warrant to be implemented so quickly. She blamed her advisors for misunderstanding her intentions, banished the secretary who had delivered the warrant, and went into a period of mourning that lasted for weeks. But privately, Elizabeth's letters from this period show relief mixed with guilt, pragmatism mixed with grief. She wrote to her cousin James VI of Scotland, Mary's son, expressing genuine sorrow for his loss, while also making it clear that Mary's execution had been necessary for the stability of both their kingdoms. The psychological transformation was complete. The vulnerable child who had once desperately sought approval had become a monarch capable of making the hardest decisions for the coldest reasons. But Elizabeth's trials weren't over, because Mary, Queen of Scots' execution had consequences that would threaten everything Elizabeth had built. The most powerful empire in the world was about to declare war on England. And Elizabeth would need every survival skill she had ever learned to face the greatest military challenge of her reign. Thunder was rolling across the English Channel, but it wasn't from any storm. July 1588, the largest invasion fleet in human history was sailing toward England's shores, and 54-year-old Elizabeth Tudor was about to face the ultimate test of everything she had learned about survival, leadership, and the psychology of power. The Spanish Armada wasn't just a military expedition. It was a holy crusade backed by the richest empire on earth, blessed by the Pope himself, and commanded by one of the most experienced admirals in Europe. Philip II of Spain had spent 2 years and the equivalent of hundreds of millions of modern dollars building this fleet specifically to destroy Elizabeth and restore Catholic rule to England. And Elizabeth was about to defeat it using weapons that Philip never saw coming: psychology, propaganda, and the most brilliant speech in English history. But first, let's understand just how impossible Elizabeth's situation really was. The Spanish Armada consisted of 130 ships carrying 30,000 men soldiers, sailors, and priests ready to reclaim England for Catholicism. The English Navy had maybe 200 ships total, most of them smaller and less heavily armed than the Spanish vessels. Spain controlled the richest territories in the Americas, had the most experienced army in Europe, and commanded resources that dwarfed England's entire economy. The smart money wasn't just on Spanish victory, it was on English annihilation. But Elizabeth had learned something during her decades of survival that Philip II never needed to understand. When you're facing overwhelming odds, you don't fight strength with strength. You fight strength with intelligence. And Elizabeth's first move was pure psychological genius. Instead of hiding in London while her admirals fought the Spanish fleet, Elizabeth decided to personally visit her troops at Tilbury, where they were preparing to repel a Spanish invasion. Now, think about how radical this decision was. Queens didn't visit battlefields. They didn't expose themselves to enemy action. They certainly didn't address soldiers directly before combat. But Elizabeth understood that this moment required more than traditional royal protocol. It required personal leadership that would inspire her outnumbered forces to fight beyond their limits. The speech Elizabeth gave at Tilbury on August 9, 1588, is one of the most psychologically sophisticated pieces of rhetoric ever recorded. And I want to break it down for you because every line was carefully calculated to maximum psychological impact. She began, "My loving people, I have been persuaded by some that are careful of my safety to take heed how I commit myself to armed multitudes for fear of treachery." Notice what she's doing here. She's acknowledging that other people think this visit is dangerous, which establishes that she's taking a real risk to be there. But she's positioning this risk as evidence of her trust in her soldiers, not her recklessness as a leader. Then came the line that would echo through history. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. This is absolutely brilliant psychology. Elizabeth is acknowledging the obvious. She's physically vulnerable compared to male rulers, but she's reframing that vulnerability as emotional strength. She's saying that being physically weak makes her psychologically stronger, because it proves her courage is genuine rather than based on physical confidence. But the most psychologically devastating part of the speech was how she positioned the conflict itself. I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. Elizabeth was transforming the Spanish invasion from a foreign attack into a personal insult to her relationship with her people. She was making every English soldier feel like they were participants in the naval battle, even though they were on shore. Elizabeth had created a sense of unified national effort that transcended the physical separation between different parts of her forces. Meanwhile, out in the Channel, the English admirals were implementing a strategy that was pure Elizabeth. Don't fight your enemy's strength. Exploit their weaknesses. The Spanish fleet was designed for a specific type of naval warfare. Boarding actions, where heavily armed soldiers would capture enemy ships through hand-to-hand combat. It was the same strategy that had made Spain the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean. But the English didn't play that game. Instead, they used their smaller, faster ships to stay just out of range of Spanish boarding attempts while pounding the Spanish fleet with long-range artillery. It was naval warfare as psychological torture. The Spanish couldn't engage their main weapons, couldn't use their primary tactical advantage, couldn't even catch the English ships that were steadily destroying them. Admiral Lord Howard, commanding the English fleet, later wrote, "We gave them the law of arms, but not the choice of combat. They came expecting a tournament and found themselves in a slaughter." But the real destruction of the Spanish Armada came from something Elizabeth couldn't have planned, but was brilliant enough to exploit: the weather. Because as the damaged Spanish fleet tried to escape northward around Scotland and Ireland, they encountered some of the worst storms in recorded history. Ships that had survived English cannon fire were destroyed by winds and waves. Soldiers who had survived combat drowned in shipwrecks off the Irish coast. Of the 130 ships that had left Spain, only about 65 made it home. Of the 30,000 men who had sailed to conquer England, fewer than 10,000 returned. Elizabeth's response to news of the Armada's destruction was psychologically perfect. Instead of gloating over Spanish suffering or claiming divine vindication, she emphasized English courage and unity. She issued a proclamation saying, "The victory belongs not to me, but to my people who have shown that the heart of England beats stronger than the armies of empires." This wasn't just gracious, it was strategically brilliant. Elizabeth was ensuring that her subjects felt ownership of the victory, which would strengthen their loyalty to her personally and their confidence in English power. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Elizabeth's handling of the Armada crisis was how she used the victory to transform England's international position. Before 1588, England was seen as a small, relatively poor island kingdom on the periphery of European politics. After the Armada, England was recognized as a major naval power capable of defeating the mightiest empire on earth. Elizabeth began leveraging this new reputation immediately. She started intervening in European conflicts, supporting Protestant forces in France and the Netherlands. She authorized privateering expeditions against Spanish shipping. She began projecting English power across the Atlantic. Most importantly, she started presenting herself not just as Queen of England, but as the Protestant champion of all Europe. There's a portrait of Elizabeth painted shortly after the Armada victory that shows her standing with her hand on a globe, with scenes of the battle visible through windows behind her. The message was clear. Elizabeth Tudor was now a world historical figure, not just a national ruler. But the psychological costs of this transformation were enormous, because the woman who had learned to survive through caution and careful calculation was now being forced to make decisions that affected the fate of nations. The responsibilities were crushing, the pressures were constant, and the isolation was complete. In her private letters from this period, Elizabeth wrote, "I find that victory brings burdens unknown to those who merely survive. When you're seen as invincible, every weakness becomes a catastrophe. Every mistake becomes a disaster." The broken child who had learned to survive in the shadows had become the most powerful woman in Europe. But power, Elizabeth was discovering, came with a loneliness that even childhood trauma hadn't prepared her for. And as she entered the final phase of her extraordinary life, she would have to confront the ultimate question. What happens when the person who spent their entire life learning to survive finally has to learn how to let go? Legends never truly die. They just choose when to become immortal. March 24th, 1603. 69-year-old Elizabeth Tudor lay dying in Richmond Palace, surrounded by courtiers who were already calculating their future under her successor. But the woman who had spent her entire life learning how to survive was about to teach the world one final lesson: how to leave a legacy that would outlast empires. Because Elizabeth's death wasn't just the end of a remarkable life. It was the culmination of the most extraordinary psychological transformation in human history. The broken 2-year-old who had been declared legally non-existent had become the most powerful ruler of her age, and the way she chose to die would prove that she had finally mastered the one skill that had eluded her throughout her traumatic childhood: the ability to trust. The final decade of Elizabeth's reign had been marked by a loneliness so profound that it would have broken anyone who hadn't been forged by childhood abandonment. All her closest friends were dead. William Cecil, her brilliant secretary who had guided her through the early years, died in 1598. Robert Dudley, the great love of her life, had died in 1588. Francis Walsingham, her spy master and protector, died in 1590. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating loss was Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, the young nobleman she had loved like a son, and then been forced to execute for treason in 1601. The Essex Rebellion was different from all the other conspiracies Elizabeth had faced, because this time the threat came from someone she genuinely loved. Essex wasn't just ambitious, he was unstable, charismatic, and convinced that Elizabeth was too old to rule effectively. When Essex stormed through London with 300 armed followers, crying that Elizabeth was surrounded by evil counselors and needed to be liberated from their influence, Elizabeth faced the most personal betrayal of her life. The psychological parallel to her childhood was inescapable. Once again, Someone she trusted was trying to destroy her. Once again, she was being told that she was the problem, that other people knew better than she did what was good for her. But this time, Elizabeth's response revealed how completely she had transformed from the vulnerable child she'd once been. Instead of trying to understand Essex's motivations or hoping for reconciliation, Elizabeth moved with cold efficiency to crush the rebellion and execute its leaders. She had learned that love, when it conflicted with survival, was a luxury she couldn't afford. The letter Elizabeth wrote to Essex before his execution is preserved in the British Library, and it's one of the most psychologically complex documents in Tudor history. She wrote, "You have forced me to choose between my heart and my crown. I pray that God will forgive us both for the choice I have made." This wasn't the language of a tyrant destroying a political enemy. This was the language of someone who understood that power required sacrifices that civilian life never demanded. But Essex's execution marked the beginning of Elizabeth's final psychological transformation. For the last 2 years of her life, she began preparing for something that had never been part of her survival strategy: letting go. The evidence for this shift is everywhere in her behavior during 1601-1603. Elizabeth stopped making long-term political plans. She began talking about her reign in the past tense. Most tellingly, she started expressing concern about what would happen to England after her death. This wasn't depression or defeat. It was something far more sophisticated. Elizabeth was conducting a strategic withdrawal from power that would ensure her legacy survived even after she was gone. Her last speech to Parliament, delivered in November 1601, is known as the Golden Speech, and it's a masterpiece of psychological engineering designed to cement her historical reputation. She said, "Though God hath raised me high, yet this I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves. This makes me that I do not so much rejoice that God hath made me to be a queen, as to be a queen over so thankful a people." Elizabeth was positioning herself not as someone who had seized power, but as someone who had been honored with the privilege of serving her people. She was transforming her entire life story from one of survival and ambition into one of service and sacrifice. But the most psychologically revealing aspect of Elizabeth's final years was how she handled the succession question that had haunted her entire reign. For 45 years, Elizabeth had refused to name an heir, using the uncertainty as a diplomatic weapon and maintaining the fiction that she might still marry and produce children. But in her final months, she quietly began preparing for a transition that would preserve everything she had built. James VI of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots' son, was the obvious choice to succeed her. But Elizabeth's genius was in how she managed this transition without ever formally announcing it. She began corresponding with James, offering advice about ruling England and subtly indicating her approval of his eventual succession. But she did this through private letters and trusted intermediaries, never making any public commitments that might destabilize her own remaining authority. Elizabeth was conducting a seamless transfer of power that maintained stability while preserving her own agency until the very end. The final weeks of Elizabeth's life reveal a woman who had achieved something unprecedented. She had learned to control not just her life, but her death. According to contemporary accounts, Elizabeth spent her last days dictating letters, organizing her papers, and making sure that important documents were properly preserved for historians. She was curating her own legacy with the same strategic intelligence she had applied to every other challenge in her life. But perhaps the most psychologically profound aspect of Elizabeth's death was what she chose to do in her final hours. Instead of clinging to power or demanding elaborate deathbed ceremonies, Elizabeth simply let go. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, reported that Elizabeth's last conscious act was to give a sign of approval when he prayed for the peaceful transition of the crown to James of Scotland. After a lifetime of never trusting anyone completely, Elizabeth chose to trust in the continuation of the institution she had served. She died on March 24, 1603 at 3:00 in the morning, surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting. According to their accounts, her last word was James, confirming her approval of her successor. But here's what makes Elizabeth's death so psychologically remarkable. She had managed to transform her childhood trauma into historical triumph. The abandoned child who'd been declared illegitimate became the queen who gave her name to an entire age. The girl who'd been told she was nobody became the woman who defeated the Spanish Armada. The survivor who had learned never to trust became the leader who was beloved by her people. Elizabeth's reign lasted 45 years and transformed England from a small, divided, relatively poor country into a major European power with a thriving culture, a strong economy, and a sense of national identity that would last for centuries. The psychological strategy she had developed to survive childhood trauma became the leadership skills that created the foundation for the British Empire. But perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth proved that it was possible to be both strategic and genuine, both careful and courageous, both protective and loving. She showed the world that trauma doesn't have to destroy you. It can forge you into something stronger than you ever imagined possible. The broken child, who should have been crushed by circumstances, became the queen who changed the course of human history. And that transformation from victim to survivor to legend is a story that belongs not just to the 16th century, but to anyone who has ever faced impossible odds and wondered whether they had the strength to overcome them. Elizabeth Tudor proved that they do. Thank you so much for staying with me through this incredible journey from broken child to immortal queen. Elizabeth's story reminds us that our greatest traumas can become our greatest strengths, and that the qualities we develop to survive our worst moments might just be the qualities that help us achieve our greatest triumphs. If Elizabeth's transformation inspired you as much as it inspired me, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of her psychological journey resonated most with you? And what other historical figures would you like to explore through this lens of trauma, survival, and ultimate triumph? Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden psychology behind history's most fascinating figures. Until next time, remember that your past doesn't define your future, but the strength you build surviving your past just might define your legacy. Sleep well and sweet dreams.